The metal cuffs bit into her wrists at exactly 2:17 a.m. under gas station lights that flickered like dying stars. Lena Brooks, 12-hour shift completed, scrubs stained with other people's blood, stood silent as Officer Derek Vance shoved her against the hood of her Honda, her medical bag spilling prescription bottles across oil-stained concrete. He didn't see the tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve. USMC intelligence insignia, earned in places that don't exist on maps. He didn't know that her silence wasn't submission, it was assessment. And he certainly didn't know that one phone call would transform this routine abuse of power into a federal case that would dismantle his entire department before sunrise. If you want to see how one quiet nurse brought down an entire corrupt system, stay with me until the end. Like this story and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this truth travels. The desert highway stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through Nevada wasteland where towns died slowly and nobody asked questions. Lena's headlights had been the only illumination for 17 miles before she pulled into the Crossroads Gas and Go, the kind of place that survived on truckers and people with nowhere better to stop. She'd been a nurse at Silver Ridge Medical Center for 3 years, working trauma rotation, where the worst of human damage arrived in ambulances screaming through the night. Tonight had been particularly brutal. A car accident involving a family of 4, 2 hours of compressions that couldn't bring back a 6-year-old girl, and the kind of exhaustion that settled into bones like cement. The gas pump clicked steadily as she leaned against her car, eyes half closed, letting the cool air wash over skin that still smelled like antiseptic and desperation. Her scrubs bore the evidence of her shift, blood spatter across the left shoulder, betadine stains on both sleeves, the particular wear pattern of someone who'd spent hours on her feet making life-and-death decisions. She didn't notice the patrol car until its headlights swept across the station, transforming the mundane into something theatrical. The Crown Victoria rolled to a stop 20 feet away, engine idling with that particular rumble of authority that cops cultivated like a signature. Officer Derek Vance emerged slowly, deliberately, his movements choreographed for maximum psychological impact. 6'2", 230 pounds, with the build of someone who'd played college football before discovering that a badge provided different kinds of power. His uniform was immaculate despite the late hour, boots polished to mirror shine, every crease sharp enough to draw blood. Lena watched him approach through the reflection in her car window, her expression neutral, body language carefully relaxed. 12 years in the Marine Corps had taught her to read threats before they announced themselves, and everything about Vance's gait screamed danger. Not the honest kind that came from legitimate law enforcement, but the petty cruelty of someone who enjoyed the uniform more than the oath. "License and registration," Vance said, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. No greeting, no explanation, just the assumption of compliance that came from years of people doing exactly what he demanded. Lena turned slowly, keeping her hands visible, movement smooth and unthreatening. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'll ask the questions." His eyes traveled over her scrubs, lingering on the bloodstains with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You always drive around looking like you murdered someone?" "I'm a trauma nurse. Just finished my shift at Silver Ridge Medical." Her voice remained calm, professional, the tone she used with patients who came in combative and confused. "My license is in my wallet, registration in the glove compartment." "Then get them." He stepped closer, invading her space with practiced precision. Slowly, she retrieved both documents with careful deliberation, handing them over without comment. Vance studied her license with exaggerated attention, comparing the photo to her face like he was authenticating a masterpiece instead of a standard Nevada ID. "Lena Marie Brooks, 29 Willow Court, apartment 4B. He read her address aloud, a subtle threat wrapped in public information. "Long way from home at this hour." "About 15 miles. I work night rotation." "That right?" He pocketed her license without asking, a clear violation of protocol that they both recognized. "Step away from the vehicle." Lena complied, her movements betraying nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She'd seen this pattern before, in Kandahar, in Helmand Province, in places where men with guns decided that authority was the same thing as immunity. The uniform changed, the geography shifted, but the fundamental dynamic remained constant, power seeking validation through subjugation. Vance circled her car like a predator assessing prey, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness with aggressive precision. He peered through windows, tested door handles, his search less about finding contraband than establishing dominance. "You seem nervous," he said, though Lena's breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. "I'm not nervous. Everyone says that." He moved to her medical bag, still lying where it had fallen during her initial stop. "What's in here?" "Medical supplies. Prescription samples from the hospital pharmacy, properly logged and authorized." His boot nudged the bag, scattering bottles across the concrete. "That's so, because from where I'm standing, looks like you might be running a little side business. A lot of pills for someone just driving home from work." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and dangerous in equal measure. Lena recognized the setup. Create a pretext, manufacture probable cause, escalate until compliance or confrontation justified whatever came next. "Those medications are documented," she said evenly. "There's a hospital log sheet in the bag's front pocket. Every item is accounted for, prescribed by attending physicians, intended for patients transitioning to outpatient care." "You a doctor now?" Vance's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're talking like you think you know better than me." "I'm explaining the facts." "Facts." He laughed, the sound harsh in the desert silence. "Here's a fact. You've got probable cause written all over you. Blood on your clothes, drugs in your possession, and an attitude problem that makes me think you're hiding something worse." The gas station clerk watched through bulletproof glass, his face carefully blank. This wasn't his first time witnessing Derek Vance's particular brand of law enforcement, and experience had taught him that intervention carried costs he couldn't afford. A semi-truck pulled into the station, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. The driver, a woman in her 50s with road-weary eyes, glanced at the scene, met Lena's gaze for a fraction of a second, then focused on her fuel pump with sudden, intense concentration. Whatever was happening here, it was none of her business, and survival meant keeping it that way. "Turn around," Vance ordered. "Hands behind your back." Lena's pulse remained steady, her breathing unchanged, but something shifted in her eyes, a calculation, a decision point, the moment where training overrode instinct. On what charge? Possession of controlled substances, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest if you keep asking questions. He pulled handcuffs from his belt with the fluid ease of long practice. "Your choice how difficult this gets." She turned slowly, offering her wrists. The metal cuffs snapped shut with mechanical precision, tight enough to demonstrate authority without quite crossing into actionable abuse. Vance had calibrated this routine over countless encounters, finding the exact pressure point where discomfort met compliance. "You know what I think?" He leaned close enough that she could smell coffee and wintergreen chewing tobacco. "I think you've been getting away with looking down on people like me your whole life. Pretty girl, respectable job, thinking you're better than the folks who actually keep this town safe." Lena said nothing, her silence more eloquent than any response. "That's what I thought." He pushed her toward his patrol car, hand heavy on her shoulder. "You people are all the same. Walk around like you own the world until someone reminds you how things really work." The semi-truck driver finished fueling and departed without a backward glance, her taillights disappearing into the darkness like witnesses to nothing at all. The clerk turned away, suddenly fascinated by inventory that definitely required his immediate attention. Vance opened the patrol car's back door, the interior smelling of industrial disinfectant and the accumulated misery of everyone who'd sat there before. "Watch your head," he said, not watching her head at all as he guided her inside with unnecessary force. The door slammed shut, transforming the world into something small and contained. Lena sat perfectly still, her wrists uncomfortable but not unbearable, her mind already moving through contingencies with the methodical precision of someone trained to operate under pressure. Through the patrol car's window, she watched Vance return to her Honda, pulling on latex gloves with theatrical slowness. He opened doors, rifled through the glove compartment, pulled floor mats up with the determined energy of someone who would keep searching until he found justification for what he'd already decided. Her medical bag received particular attention. Bottles examined one by one, labels photographed with his phone, the documentation she'd mentioned apparently invisible to his selective investigation. He pocketed 3 prescription bottles, Oxy, Vicodin, Ambien, all properly logged, all legally possessed, all about to become evidence of crimes that existed only in his narrative. 20 minutes passed. The desert night offered no comfort, temperature dropping as stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Lena controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate through techniques learned in rooms where enemy interrogators had access to tools that made handcuffs seem gentle. Vance finally returned, sliding into the driver's seat with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game that only he knew he was playing. He twisted to face her through the metal cage separating front from back, his expression a mixture of triumph and contempt. "So here's what's going to happen," he said, consulting his phone where photographs of her medications glowed accusatory in the dashboard light. "We're going to take a ride to the station. You're going to be processed for possession with intent to distribute. We're going to search your apartment. I've got a judge who signs warrants at any hour, and we're going to find out exactly what kind of operation you're running." "I'm not running anything. Those are hospital samples, properly documented." "Your documentation," he smiled, "against my word and photographic evidence of controlled substances in your possession. Who do you think they'll believe?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a thesis statement about power and credibility, about who got trusted and who got convicted, about systems that functioned exactly as designed for people who knew how to manipulate them. Lena met his eyes in the rearview mirror, her expression still neutral, still calm, still giving him nothing he could use. "I need to make a phone call." Vance laughed, genuine amusement coloring the sound. "You think this is TV? You think you get a lawyer right now?" "Here's how Nevada law works. You get processed first, photographed, fingerprinted, evaluated. Then, if you're cooperative and I'm feeling generous, maybe you get your phone call. Maybe. It's my legal right. Your rights are what I say they are at 2:30 in the morning on a deserted highway." He started the engine, the patrol car rumbling to life. "But you know what? I like you. You're polite, you're not crying or screaming, you're making this easy. So here's what I'll do. You sit quiet for the ride, answer my questions when we get to the station, and I'll make sure that phone call happens. Deal?" The offer was a trap wrapped in false generosity, a promise made to be broken the moment it became inconvenient. Lena recognized it immediately, just as she recognized that argument would only escalate a situation already balanced on the edge of something worse. "Deal," she said quietly. Vance pulled out of the gas station, leaving her Honda abandoned under flickering lights, her medical bags still scattered across concrete that had seen too many similar scenes. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark, the dotted line disappearing into distance like a countdown to consequences. For 10 miles, neither spoke. The police radio crackled occasionally with distant dispatches from a county that spanned thousands of square miles and trusted men like Derek Vance to maintain order in the spaces between towns. The dashboard computer glowed with databases and reports, the modern infrastructure of law enforcement overlaying very old patterns of abuse. "You married?" Vance asked suddenly, his voice casual, conversational, as if they were strangers making small talk rather than captor and prisoner. "No." "Boyfriend?" "No." "Family in town?" "No." He nodded, each answer confirming something in his mental calculation. No husband to call lawyers, no boyfriend to raise questions, no family to mount rescue operations or demand accountability. Just a woman alone, exhausted, without the social infrastructure that might make her disappearance or degradation inconvenient. "That's rough," he said, with utterly false sympathy. "Pretty girl like you, saving lives, going home to an empty apartment, must get lonely." Lena didn't respond, recognizing the shift in his tone, the subtle movement from professional antagonist to something more personally threatening. "I mean, I get it," he continued, warming to his theme. "The hours you work, the stress, the trauma you see every night. No wonder you need something to take the edge off. Nobody's judging you for that. Hell, half the nurses I know have prescription problems. It's practically expected in your line of work." The trap was obvious: confess to addiction that didn't exist, provide voluntary explanation for planted evidence, construct the narrative that would justify whatever he'd already decided. Lena had seen interrogators in Afghanistan with more subtlety, but Vance didn't need sophistication. He had a badge, a gun, and the reasonable certainty that nobody was coming to interrupt. I don't have a prescription problem, she said flatly. I don't have any problem. I was driving home from work, following all traffic laws, bothering nobody. See, that's the thing, though. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, eyes cold despite the conversational tone. You were bothering me. You were bothering me by being on that highway at that hour, by having all those drugs, by looking at me like I'm the problem when you're the one with blood on your clothes and an attitude. The word attitude carried particular weight, the kind of accusation that had justified violence against countless women who'd failed to demonstrate sufficient deference to men who expected it as tribute. They crossed into Mitchell County, a jurisdiction where Vance wore sergeant stripes and the sheriff owed his election to the police union's endorsement. The landscape remained unchanged, desert and darkness, mountains silhouetted against stars, but the invisible boundaries of power shifted, tilting further in Vance's favor. The Mitchell County Sheriff's Station appeared like a fortress in the wasteland, concrete and razor wire and floodlights that turned night into interrogation room brightness. 3 patrol cars sat in the lot, their occupants presumably inside processing the night's collection of DUIs, domestics, and people who'd made the mistake of being vulnerable in Derek Vance's territory. He parked in a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and sat for a long moment, studying her through the cage like she was a specimen in need of classification. Last chance for easy, he said. You admit you've got a problem, agree to treatment, maybe some community service, and this whole thing goes away. No arrest record, no trial, no permanent consequences. Just a woman who made some mistakes and got help before things got worse. The offer was another layer of trap. Admission as evidence, cooperation as confession, his mercy as her conviction. Lena had interrogated actual terrorists who'd been more honest about their intentions. I want my phone call, she said. Vance's expression hardened, false friendliness evaporating like water on hot asphalt. You want? You think you're in a position to want things? Nevada Revised Statutes, Section 171.153. A person arrested for any offense must be allowed to make at least 2 completed telephone calls within 3 hours of arrest, not after processing, not after booking, within 3 hours of the initial detention. The recitation of actual law shifted something in the car's atmosphere, Vance's confidence flickering as he encountered resistance that came armed with specific legal knowledge rather than generic complaint. You a lawyer too? The question came edged with genuine irritation. I know my rights. Your rights. He opened his door, climbed out, slammed it hard enough to make the whole vehicle shudder. We'll see about your rights. He pulled her from the back seat without gentleness, his hand tight on her upper arm, guiding her toward the station entrance with the kind of casual force that left bruises without breaking skin. The handcuffs bit deeper as her weight shifted, metal edges finding nerve clusters that sent sharp signals up her arms. The station's interior smelled like every police facility in every country Lena had ever visited. Industrial cleaner failing to mask sweat, fear, and the particular staleness of institutions where ventilation was functional rather than comfortable. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their frequency just wrong enough to induce headaches after extended exposure. A desk sergeant looked up from paperwork, registered Vance's entrance with professional disinterest, noted the cuffed woman in bloody scrubs with the kind of non-reaction that suggested this scene played out regularly enough to be routine. Got a live one, Derek? The sergeant's name tag read Morrison, and his tone suggested they'd shared many similar nights. Possession with intent. Found her at the Crossroads station with enough pills to stock a pharmacy. Vance pushed Lena toward the booking desk, his narrative flowing with practiced ease. Gave me some story about being a nurse, but you know how that goes. Morrison nodded sagely, already pulling forms from a drawer, the bureaucratic machinery of conviction spinning up before any actual evidence had been examined. ID? Lena Brooks, 29 Willow Court. Already ran her, no priors, but there's always a first time. Vance tossed her license onto the desk like it was evidence of guilt rather than basic documentation. I need to make a phone call, Lena said, directing her words to Morrison rather than Vance, hoping that different personnel might mean different outcomes. Morrison glanced at Vance, a silent question passing between them. Vance shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying that he'd already offered this privilege and been rebuffed. that her current request was entitled rather than legally mandated. "You'll get your call after processing," Morrison said, returning to his forms. "Height, weight for the record?" 5'6", 125. Vance answered for her, his estimates close enough to accurate. "And before you ask, yes, she's been informed of charges, yes, she understands her situation, and yes, she's been cooperative. Mostly." The word "mostly" carried implications, suggestions of resistance that might justify whatever methods proved necessary to ensure continued compliance. A door opened in the back hallway, releasing voices and the distinctive chemical smell of evidence processing. Two deputies emerged, escorting a man in his 50s who looked like every third person in Nevada, worn denim, sun-damaged skin, the exhausted resignation of someone for whom arrest was routine rather than catastrophic. The man met Lena's eyes for a second, his expression offering something between sympathy and warning. Then he was gone, processed through to holding cells that waited somewhere deeper in the building's concrete intestines. "Sit," Vance ordered, pointing to a metal bench bolted to the wall. "You move without permission. That's additional charges." Lena sat, her hands still cuffed behind her back, forcing her to lean forward in a position that became uncomfortable within minutes and excruciating after an hour. The posture was deliberate, another layer of degradation calibrated to break Will without leaving evidence. Vance conferred with Morrison in tones too low for her to hear, their conversation punctuated by glances in her direction, occasional laughter that suggested she was the punchline to jokes she wasn't meant to understand. More deputies filtered through, change of shift bringing fresh personnel who would need to be briefed on the night's arrests and the stories that justified them. 20 minutes became 30. Lena's shoulders began to burn, the cuffs cutting circulation enough to send pins and needles sensation through her fingers. She controlled her breathing, slowing it deliberately, dropping her heart rate through sheer will, accessing training that had sustained her through situations that made this seem merely uncomfortable rather than unbearable. A female deputy, name tag reading Santos, approached with a camera and fingerprint equipment, her expression professionally neutral. "Stand up, face the wall." Lena complied, her movements stiff from forced immobility. The booking photos captured her from multiple angles, flashbulbs preserving her exhaustion and blood-stained scrubs for databases that would follow her through background checks and employment screenings, permanent record of an arrest that had no legal foundation. Fingerprints came next, Santos pressing her fingers against digital scanners with impersonal efficiency. "You can request cleaning wipes after we're done," she said quietly, the first gesture toward humanity Lena had encountered since Vance's initial stop. "Thank you," Lena said, the words automatic, polite, unchanged by circumstances that might excuse rudeness. Santos paused, really looking at her for the first time. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, perhaps? Or just the awareness that this didn't fit the usual pattern of 2 a.m. arrests in Mitchell County. "You really a nurse?" Santos asked, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the desk where Vance was completing paperwork. "Trauma rotation at Silver Ridge Medical. Just finished a 12-hour shift when Officer Vance pulled me over." "For what?" "He hasn't said, but he's charging me with possession of prescription samples that are properly logged and legally distributed by the hospital pharmacy." Santos's jaw tightened fractionally, the smallest betrayal of opinion quickly suppressed. Whatever she thought about Vance's arrest, expressing it would mean choosing sides in department politics where Derek Vance held rank and grudges. "Your phone call," Santos said instead. "You requested one?" 3 times, Officer Vance said after processing, but Nevada law says within 3 hours of detention. "Yeah." Santos's tone suggested she knew exactly how often that particular statute got honored in Mitchell County. "Let me see what I can do." She walked to the desk, spoke quietly to Morrison, who glanced at Vance, who was suddenly very interested in the conversation. Their discussion involved gestures toward Lena, checking of watches, consultation of paperwork, the whole performance of men deciding whether to follow rules or convenience. Finally, Vance approached, his expression suggesting he was doing her an enormous favor rather than honoring basic legal rights. "Fine. 1 call, local only, 5 minutes, monitored and recorded. You use it to coordinate anything illegal. That's additional charges. Understood?" "Understood." He unlocked her handcuffs, metal scraping across abraded skin, circulation returning in painful rushes. Lena rotated her wrist slowly, assessing damage. Bruises definitely. Maybe minor nerve compression, nothing permanent if this ended soon. Vance led her to a phone mounted on the wall near the booking desk, an old landline model with worn buttons and a curly cord that smelled like decades of desperate conversations. 5 minutes, he repeated, starting now. Lena lifted the receiver, her fingers moving across the number pad with absolute precision. The number she dialed wasn't local. It was a Virginia area code followed by an extension that bypassed civilian operators and connected directly to Department of Defense emergency response. The line clicked 3 times, encrypted routing engaging, then a voice answered with professional neutrality. DoD personnel recovery. Authentication required. This is former Staff Sergeant Lena Marie Brooks, USMC, Service Number 2461782, Intelligence Specialist, Honorable Discharge, February 2021. Her voice remained steady, formal, the clipped precision of someone reporting to superior officers. Authentication code? Foxtrot Romeo 77 Kilo. Vance frowned, moving closer, his earlier confidence beginning to crack. What is this? Who are you calling? Lena ignored him, her entire focus on the voice that had gone from neutral to alert. Copy Staff Sergeant Brooks. Authentication confirmed. State your emergency. I've been illegally detained by local law enforcement in Mitchell County, Nevada. False charges, illegal search, violation of multiple civil rights statutes. I'm currently at Mitchell County Sheriff's Station, booking desk, being processed on fabricated drug possession charges. She recited facts without emotion, situation report rather than plea for help. No injuries yet, but situation is escalating. Request immediate intervention and documentation. Understood. Hold position. Help is en route. Can you remain on this line? Negative. Call is being monitored by detaining officer who appears increasingly agitated. Copy. Log this call as evidence. Do not resist. Federal support will arrive within 30 minutes. Confirm you understand. Confirmed. You're no longer alone, Marine. We've got you. Lena hung up, the receiver clicking into its cradle with finality. She turned to face Vance, whose expression had progressed from annoyed to genuinely worried, and offered the smallest smile. Not friendly, not threatening, just the recognition of someone who just changed the game's entire rulebook. What the hell was that? Vance demanded. Who did you just call? The Pentagon, Lena said simply. And I think you should call your supervisor. The words hung in the fluorescent-lit air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Morrison's pen stopped mid-stroke. Santos froze halfway to the evidence locker. Even the drunk in holding cell 3 went quiet, as if the entire building had collectively held its breath. Vance's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. The Pentagon? You think this is funny? You think making prank calls to government offices is going to help your situation? I didn't call an office. I called the Department of Defense Personnel Recovery Division. They have my service record, my security clearance history, and as of 90 seconds ago, a recorded log of this illegal detention. Lena's voice remained level, but something had shifted in her posture, the exhausted nurse replaced by someone who stood differently, spoke differently, radiated an authority that had nothing to do with badges or uniforms. Morrison finally found his voice. Derek, what's she talking about? Service record? She's lying. But Vance's certainty had developed cracks. It's a bluff. Probably called some friend, some boyfriend who she thinks can intimidate us with military talk. The call routing took 3 encrypted redirects, Lena said. Standard DoD emergency protocol. Your recording equipment captured the authentication sequence. You can verify it if you want, but I wouldn't recommend wasting the time. You've got maybe 28 minutes before federal agents arrive, and you should probably use that time calling someone with actual legal authority. Santos pulled out her phone, fingers moving across the screen with sudden urgency. Whatever she was searching for, she found it quickly, her expression shifting from skeptical to alarmed. Derek, I'm looking at Lena Marie Brooks, former Marine Corps Staff Sergeant, Intelligence Specialist. Served in Afghanistan, decorated, honorable discharge. This could be real. Let me see that. Vance grabbed the phone, his eyes scanning the screen, face-paling as public record contradicted his carefully constructed narrative. Intelligence specialist doesn't mean anything. Lots of people served. Doesn't give them the right to trust. To what? Lena interrupted quietly. To know my legal rights? To document civil rights violations? To contact federal authorities when those rights are systematically violated by local law enforcement? You're not being violated. You were arrested on legitimate charges, based on legally possessed prescription samples that are documented in hospital records. You photographed the evidence, but not the documentation sheet that was in the same bag. You detained me without probable cause, denied me timely access to communication, and threatened illegal search of my residence. She recited the violations like items on a grocery list, each one landing with prosecutorial precision. And you did all of this while I was returning home from a 12-hour shift where I saved the lives of 3 people, including a 16-year-old boy who would have bled out in your jurisdiction if I hadn't been there to compress his severed femoral artery. Morrison had gone very still, the kind of stillness that came from watching a situation spiral beyond control. Derek, maybe we should what? Let her walk because she made a phone call? Because she's got some military record from years ago? Vance's voice had risen, volume compensating for crumbling authority. She had controlled substances. I witnessed it. That's probable cause in any court. Probable cause requires reasonable belief that a crime occurred, Lena said. Hospital employees transporting prescribed medications in logged containers isn't a crime. It's literally part of my job description. What you have is a predetermined narrative that you're trying to support with selective documentation. A phone rang at the front desk, not the usual station line, but Morrison's personal cell. He answered, listened, his face going from pale to gray. Sheriff's on his way in. Wants everyone to stay put until he arrives. At 3 a.m? Santos checked her watch. He never comes in for bookings. Never. He does when the Department of Defense calls his personal line, Morrison said quietly. Which apparently just happened. The station's atmosphere transformed, routine processing replaced by the electric tension of personnel who just realized they were in a situation far beyond their training or authority. Deputies who'd been processing other arrests suddenly found urgent reasons to complete paperwork. The drunken holding three started loudly demanding his phone call, as if collective attention on anything else might provide escape from whatever was coming. Vance paced behind the booking desk, his earlier swagger replaced by the jerky movements of someone whose carefully constructed world was developing structural cracks. This is insane. We arrest people every day. We follow procedure. She had drugs. I documented it. This is by the book. Is it? Santos had apparently decided that self-preservation outweighed department loyalty. Because I'm looking at the booking sheet, and you've got her listed as uncooperative and potentially dangerous, but she's been nothing but calm and polite since she walked in. You've got her charged with resisting arrest, but there's no body cam footage, no backup witness, just your word. My word as a 15-year veteran should be enough. Against a decorated Marine who just made a call that brought DOD and the sheriff out of bed at 3 a.m.? Morrison shook his head slowly. Derek, I've known you a long time, but this feels wrong. This feels really wrong. Lena remained by the phone, watching the department fracture in real time as officers who'd accepted Vance's authority without question suddenly discovered the value of critical thinking. She said nothing, her silence more damning than any accusation, letting the weight of consequences build without her help. The front doors opened, admitting night air and Sheriff Marcus Hardwick, a 60-year-old career law enforcement officer who'd won 5 elections by being competent, cautious, and deeply aware of which battles to fight. He wore civilian clothes thrown on in obvious haste, his expression the particular fury of someone whose sleep had been interrupted by problems that shouldn't exist. Conference room. Now. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Morrison, Santos, Vance, and Ms. Brooks, if you'd please join us. The conference room was standard institutional, folding table, uncomfortable chairs, whiteboard still showing notes from training sessions on de-escalation techniques that apparently hadn't taken. Hardwick closed the door, pointed everyone to seats, and remained standing himself, arms crossed, jaw tight. I just spent 10 minutes on the phone with a DOD liaison officer who used words like federal investigation, civil rights violation, and potential prosecution of department personnel. his gaze fixed on Vance like a rifle sight. Someone explained to me how a routine traffic stop turned into an international incident. Sir, it wasn't a traffic stop. Vance had regained some composure, defaulting to official report mode. I observed a suspicious vehicle at the Crossroads gas station at approximately 02:15 hours. Driver was acting nervous, wearing clothing with apparent bloodstains, in possession of multiple controlled substances without proper documentation. I had documentation, Lena interrupted calmly. Hospital log sheet right in the front pocket of my medical bag where I told Officer Vance it would be. He photographed the medications but not the paperwork. Hardwick turned to her, his expression slightly less hostile. You're the former Staff Sergeant Brooks? Yes, sir. Intelligence specialist, served in Afghanistan, clearance level. The DOD officer wouldn't tell me your clearance level, which tells me it's high enough that he couldn't discuss it on an unsecured line. Hardwick pinched the bridge of his nose like he could physically compress the headache building behind his eyes. And you're currently employed as a trauma nurse at Silver Ridge Medical Center? That's correct. I finished my shift at 0200, stopped for gas on my way home, and was detained by Officer Vance without clear probable cause. She had drugs, Vance insisted. Oxy, Vicodin, Ambien, enough to treat acute pain in post-surgical patients transitioning to outpatient care, Lena finished, which is literally what those medications are prescribed for and why nurses transport them from hospital pharmacy to patient homes. It's not only legal, it's standard medical practice. Santos cleared her throat. Sir, if I may, I've seen these transport protocols before. My sister's a home health nurse. They carry samples all the time, always with documentation. If there was a log sheet and Derek didn't photograph it, then we've got a problem. Hardwick sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. A serious problem, because if this is what it looks like, we've just handed DOD enough ammunition to audit every arrest this department has made in the last 5 years. The implications settled over the room like fallout. Morrison's hand shook slightly as he checked his watch. Santos stared at the table. Vance's jaw worked soundlessly, cycling through denials that wouldn't survive scrutiny. Ms. Brooks, Hardwick said quietly, I need you to be straight with me. Are you claiming that Officer Vance planted evidence or that he simply documented selectively? I'm claiming he arrested me without probable cause, denied me timely access to communication as guaranteed by state law, and is now attempting to justify that arrest with partial documentation that supports a predetermined narrative. Lena's voice remained professional, almost gentle, which somehow made the accusations more devastating. Whether that constitutes planting evidence or selective prosecution is a legal question above my expertise. But I can tell you that in 12 years of military service, I saw this exact pattern in places where rule of law was aspirational rather than functional. That's, Vance started. Shut up, Derek. Hardwick didn't even look at him. Ms. Brooks, what outcome are you looking for here? Because I'm going to be honest, DOD involvement means this is already beyond my control. But if there's a way to resolve this that doesn't end with federal investigators turning my department inside out, I'm listening. Lena considered the question, her expression thoughtful. I want my belongings returned, starting with my car and medical supplies. I want this arrest expunged from all records, including the fingerprints and photographs your department just took. I want written documentation that no charges will be filed and no further action will be taken. Done. What else? I want to know that I wasn't the first. She leaned forward slightly, her calm finally showing cracks of genuine anger. I want to know how many other women Officer Vance has stopped on empty highways at 2 in the morning, how many other people he's arrested for possessing things that were completely legal, how many times this department has let it happen because it was easier than asking questions. The room went very quiet. Morrison found something fascinating about his fingernails. Santos's jaw tightened. Vance stared at the wall like he could will himself somewhere else. Hardwick closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment looked less like a sheriff than a man watching his career and reputation collapse in real time. There have been complaints, allegations, nothing that rose to the level of formal investigation. Because the people making complaints didn't have DOD on speed dial, Lena said. Because they were vulnerable, isolated, exactly the kind of targets Officer Vance felt safe abusing. That's not fair. Vance found his voice finally, desperation bleeding through. I've made hundreds of legitimate arrests, saved lives, protected this community for 15 years. And how many of those arrests followed this exact pattern? Lena's question hung unanswered. Late night, isolated location, someone alone and tired, charges that sounded plausible enough to justify detention but never quite made it to trial. How many people paid fines, accepted plea deals, agreed to probation for crimes they didn't commit because fighting you seemed harder than just making it go away? Santos stood abruptly, walked to the corner of the room, her back to everyone. Her shoulders shook slightly. Anger or tears or both. Deputy Santos? Hardwick's voice had gone very soft, the tone of someone who already knew the answer but needed to hear it said aloud. My cousin, Santos said without turning around. 2 years ago. Derek pulled her over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. Found an open container that she swears wasn't there. She paid the fine rather than fight because she couldn't afford a lawyer and couldn't risk losing her job if it went to trial. Jesus Christ, Morson's whisper barely carried across the table. There's more, Santos continued, turning now, tears tracking down her face, but her voice steady. I hear things. The night shift guys, they tell stories. Women mostly, sometimes men, always alone, always at night. Derek has this reputation for making arrests that stick just enough to be inconvenient, but not enough to warrant appeals. And we all knew. We all fucking knew, and nobody said anything because he's senior, he's connected, and because proving it would mean admitting we'd been complicit. Vance shot to his feet. This is insane. You're letting her get in your heads. She's a suspect making accusations. Sit down, Derek. Hardwick's voice could have frozen metal. Don't say another word. Don't move. Don't even breathe loudly. The sheriff pulled out his phone, dialed, waited through 2 rings. It's Hardwick. I need internal affairs, county prosecutor's office, and our department attorney. Yes, now. I don't care what time it is. We've got a situation that needs handling before the feds arrive, and we've got maybe 20 minutes. He paused, listening. Tell them it's about Detective Vance and pattern of civil rights violations. That should motivate urgency. Vance's face had gone from pale to ashen, the color of someone watching their entire life unravel in a conference room with bad lighting and worse coffee. Sir, please. I've served this department. You've embarrassed this department. You've potentially committed multiple felonies. And you've done it while wearing my badge. In my jurisdiction, representing an institution I've spent 30 years trying to build. Hardwick's fury was all the more terrible for being quiet. Best case scenario, you're fired and prosecuted for the violations we can prove. Worst case, you've compromised every arrest you've ever made and opened us to lawsuits that will bankrupt the county. Morson checked his phone, face going pale. Sir, there's a vehicle approaching. 3 minutes out. Plates come back federal. Of course they do. Hardwick turned to Lena. Ms. Brooks, I can't undo what's been done to you tonight. I can't repair your trust in law enforcement or compensate you for this violation. All I can do is promise that this gets investigated, documented, and prosecuted to the fullest extent possible. And I can ask, not demand, but ask, that when the federal agents arrive, you tell them we're cooperating fully. Lena studied him for a long moment, assessing sincerity versus self-preservation. Will you open the previous cases? Every arrest Vance has made in the last 5 years? Minimum? Yes. Will you reach out to the victims, offer them opportunity for appeals or expungement? Yes. Will you implement oversight protocols that prevent this from happening again? Already planning it. Hardwick's expression suggested he was calculating budgets and political fallout in real time. Body cameras, mandatory backup on isolated stops, civilian review board, whatever it takes. Then I'll tell them you're cooperating. Lena stood, her scrub still stained with blood from saving lives, while Vance had been planning to destroy hers. But I want that in writing, Sheriff, and I want updates, because if this turns into empty promises once the federal heat dies down, I guarantee you I know who to call. Understood. The front doors of the station opened, footsteps echoing down the hallway with military precision, Not the casual stride of local law enforcement, but the purposeful gait of people who'd flown across 3 states in the middle of the night. Because one of their own had triggered emergency protocols. Morrison appeared in the conference room doorway, his expression somewhere between awe and terror. "Sir, there are federal agents here, DOD credentials. They're asking for Staff Sergeant Brooks." "Send them in," Hardwick said, standing, straightening his hastily donned shirt like he could somehow create professional appearance through sheer will. 2 agents entered, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in uniform before transitioning to civilian service, and a woman perhaps 10 years younger, both wearing dark suits and expressions that suggested they'd seen far worse situations than small-town sheriff stations but were nonetheless unimpressed. "Sheriff Hardwick?" The male agent offered a badge and credentials. "Special Agent Marcus Chen, Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. This is Special Agent Sarah Reeves. We're here regarding Staff Sergeant Lena Brooks. She's here, she's safe, and we're cooperating fully with any investigation." Hardwick's words came quickly. The speech of someone trying to establish cooperation before accusations started flying. Chen's gaze moved past him, fixing on Lena with an expression that warmed fractionally. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, are you injured?" "Minor wrist abrasions from handcuffs. Nothing requiring medical attention." Lena's posture had shifted again, the casual confidence of someone who'd just been joined by overwhelming reinforcements. "Did they allow you your phone call within the legally required time frame?" "After significant delay and only following multiple requests." Reeves pulled out a tablet, fingers moving across the screen. "We've logged the call, documentation of delay, and audio recording of your authentication sequence. Do you wish to file formal complaint against the arresting officer and this department?" "I wish to file formal complaint against Officer Derek Vance specifically," Lena clarified. "Sheriff Hardwick has pledged full cooperation, internal investigation of Vance's previous arrests, and implementation of oversight protocols. I'd like that cooperation documented and verified, but I don't believe the entire department is complicit." Chen nodded approvingly, like she'd just passed a test. Measured response. "Good. We'll need your statement, medical documentation of any injuries, and copies of all arrest records, including photographs and fingerprints for potential expungement. Sheriff, can you provide those materials?" "Immediately." Hardwick gestured to Morrison. "Get everything, now." "What about Vance?" Santos spoke up, her voice still rough from earlier tears. "Does he just walk out of here?" "No." Reeves didn't look up from her tablet. "Based on Staff Sergeant Brooks's testimony and the pattern evidence you've just confirmed, we're recommending immediate suspension pending federal investigation. Civil rights violations, deprivation of rights under color of law, possible conspiracy if it turns out other department members actively facilitated his conduct." Vance had remained seated, statue still, his earlier bluster completely evaporated. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was doing my job, keeping people safe." "You were abusing your authority," Chen said flatly. "There's a difference, and you knew it. The question now is whether you cooperate with our investigation or whether we dig through every arrest report, every body cam, every interaction you've had for the last decade. Your choice. I want a lawyer. Smart." Reeves pulled out handcuffs, not local department issue, but federal restraints, built heavier and more secure. "Derek Vance, you're being detained for questioning regarding violations of Title 18, United States Code Sections 242 and 371. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning filled the conference room as Reeves cuffed Vance with the kind of professional efficiency that came from doing this hundreds of times. Vance didn't resist, didn't argue, just stood and allowed himself to be processed with the same casual disregard for dignity he'd shown countless others. Santos watched with an expression of mingled satisfaction and grief. The complicated emotions of watching justice served on someone she'd worked beside for years. Morrison looked ill, probably calculating how many of his own cases might get caught in the review process. "Sheriff," Chen said once Vance had been led away to a federal vehicle waiting outside, "we'll need full access to your records, personnel files, and any complaint logs. We'll also want interviews with every deputy who worked night shift over the last 5 years. You'll have everything." Hardwick's defeat was complete, His earlier authority replaced by the resignation of someone who knew his department would never be the same. For what it's worth, I didn't know. I should have known. I should have seen the pattern, but I didn't. That's a failure, Chen agreed, not unkindly. But it's a different failure than Vance's malice. We'll document both. Morrison returned with a folder stuffed with paperwork. Lena's arrest records, photographs, fingerprint cards, all the bureaucratic residue of wrongful detention. Reeves collected everything, produced forms that promised expungement, documentation that the arrest had been vacated, protection against future prosecution for charges that should never have existed. Staff Sergeant Brooks, Chen said, "We'll need you to come with us to give a formal statement. Shouldn't take more than a couple hours, and we can arrange transportation back to your vehicle afterward." "My car's still at the gas station," Lena said, "along with my medical bag and everything Vance dumped on the ground. We'll retrieve it all, document it as evidence, and return it to you." Reeves checked her tablet. "We've already dispatched a team to secure the scene. Nothing will be disturbed or lost." Santos stepped forward, hesitant but determined. "Ms. Brooks, I just want to say, I'm sorry. For my cousin, for everyone Vance hurt, for not speaking up sooner. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Lena regarded her for a moment, then nodded once. "You spoke up tonight. When it mattered. That counts for something." "Not enough." "Maybe not, but it's a start." The gas station clerk from the Crossroads had appeared in the station lobby, drawn by the federal presence and the kind of curiosity that overcame caution when authority figures seemed to be eating their own. Chen spotted him immediately, professional instincts recognizing a witness. "Sir, were you working at the Crossroads Gas and Go earlier this evening?" The clerk nodded nervously. "Yeah, saw the whole thing. Officer pulled her over, searched her car, arrested her. I wanted to help, but Vance has a reputation, for remembering people who get involved." "We'll need your statement too," Reeves said, "and anyone else who witnessed the detention. There was a truck driver." "Left before the arrest happened," Lena provided. "Female driver, maybe 55, semi with a Montana plate. I didn't get the number." "We'll find her." Chen made notes. "Truck stop cameras, way station logs. If she saw anything, we'll get her testimony." Hardwick watched the federal machine spin up with the expression of someone who just realized how thoroughly his department was about to be dissected. "How long will this investigation take?" "Months, minimum." Chen didn't sugarcoat it. "We'll be thorough. Every complaint, every arrest, every interaction. And if we find evidence of institutional knowledge or cover-up beyond what's been disclosed tonight, the scope expands accordingly." "Understood." Outside, dawn was beginning to threaten the eastern horizon, the desert sky lightening from black to deep purple. Lena stood in the station parking lot, federal agents flanking her like honor guard, watching as the sheriff's department that had degraded her hours earlier scrambled to cooperate with an investigation that would reshape it completely. Her phone, finally returned from evidence, buzzed with messages. Hospital administration, checking on her absence from upcoming shifts. Colleagues who'd heard through the night shift gossip network that something had happened. And one text from the Pentagon liaison officer who'd taken her emergency call. "Marine takes care of Marine, glad you're safe." She typed a brief response. "Semper Fi." Chen gestured to an unmarked sedan. "Ready to give that statement?" "Yes." Lena paused, looking back at the station where Vance's career and freedom were being systematically dismantled. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How often does this work? Someone makes the call, federal help arrives, justice actually happens?" Chen's expression suggested he understood the real question, whether tonight was exception or pattern, whether the system worked or she'd just gotten lucky. "Honestly, not often enough. Most people don't have your training, don't know the protocols, don't have security clearances that trigger emergency response. Most people get processed, convicted, their lives permanently damaged, and nobody with real authority ever knows it happened. So I was lucky. You were trained. There's a difference." He opened the sedan door. "But yeah, you were also lucky. And now we're going to use your luck to help the people who weren't so fortunate." The federal building where they took her statement was 40 minutes away in Carson City, a concrete fortress that hummed with the kind of security that made military bases look casual. Lena spent 3 hours recounting every detail of her detention, from Vance's initial approach to the moment Chen and Reeves had walked into that conference room. 2 stenographers documented everything. Video cameras recorded from 3 angles. Every statement was fact-checked against evidence, compared to patterns from other cases, cross-referenced with complaint logs that the Mitchell County Sheriff's Department had maintained but apparently never seriously investigated. "We're building a pattern of practice case," Reeves explained during a break. "Single incident gets charged as individual civil rights violation. Pattern of practice means we can go after systemic failures, departmental policies, everyone who enabled Vance's conduct through action or inaction." "How many victims?" Lena asked. "We've identified 17 complaints in the last 5 years that match the profile. Isolated stops, questionable probable cause, charges that resolved through plea deals rather than trials. That's just from official complaints. We expect the real number to be significantly higher once we make it known that victims can come forward safely." 17 lives disrupted or destroyed because one man with a badge had enjoyed the power and nobody had stopped him. Lena felt fury building behind her professional calm, the kind of anger that had sustained her through firefights and loss, and situations where fury was the only appropriate response to injustice. "I want to help," she said, "however I can." "You already are." Reeves gestured to the documentation stacked on the table. "Your testimony is the cornerstone. Former military, current medical professional, impeccable record, and you documented everything with the kind of precision that makes prosecutors very happy. But if you're asking whether you can do more, yes. Victim advocacy, testimony in other cases if defendants choose to appeal based on Vance's pattern, maybe even consultation on training protocols for departments that want to do better." "I'll do all of it." Chen returned with coffee that tasted like institutional compromise, but contained enough caffeine to offset Lena's exhaustion. "Your car's been recovered, everything documented and photographed. Medical bag intact, all medications accounted for. We'll keep it as evidence for now, but you should have it back within a week. What about my shift tonight?" Lena checked her watch. Somehow it was already past noon, the sun high and harsh after a night that had lasted geological ages. "We've contacted Silver Ridge Medical Administration. Explained the situation in terms that don't violate ongoing investigation security. They're excusing your absence and providing victim support resources." Chen paused. "They also want to discuss having you train their staff on what to do if they're stopped by law enforcement while transporting medications. Apparently this isn't the first time it's been an issue, but you're the first person who knew how to escalate properly. More victims, more people who'd been stopped and questioned and potentially arrested for doing their jobs legally." The scope of Vance's damage kept expanding, each new revelation adding weight to crimes that were already unconscionable. By mid-afternoon, Lena's statement was complete, documented, and secured in databases that would follow the case through whatever prosecutions emerged. A federal agent drove her back to the Crossroads Gas and Go, where her Honda sat exactly as she'd left it, surrounded by evidence markers and crime scene tape that transformed a routine gas stop into something official. Her medical bag had been carefully repacked, medications logged and sealed, the documentation sheet that Vance had ignored now prominently displayed and photographed from multiple angles. Everything she'd said about legal possession and proper protocol was now part of federal record, her truth validated by people with actual authority. She sat in her car for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, letting reality settle. 12 hours ago, she'd been a nurse finishing a trauma shift. Now she was the central witness in a federal civil rights investigation that would reshape law enforcement in Mitchell County and potentially ripple outward to similar cases across the region. Her phone rang. Sheriff Hardwick's personal number, which Chen had provided in case she needed to coordinate anything. "Ms. Brooks," Hardwick said when she answered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I wanted to call personally to apologize. Not as sheriff making official statements, but as a human being who failed to protect you and everyone else Vance hurt. I'm sorry, that's inadequate, but it's the truth." "What happens to him?" Lena asked. "Federal prosecution for civil rights violations, almost certainly. We're suspending him without pay pending investigation, and if even half of what we're finding is true, he'll never work in law enforcement again. Criminal charges are likely. Prison time is possible." Hardwick paused. And we're reviewing every case, every arrest, reaching out to everyone who filed complaints. Some of those people will get justice years late, but they'll get it. That's something. It's not enough. It'll never be enough." His voice cracked slightly. "But it's what I can do, and I'm going to do it as thoroughly as possible. You have my word." Lena ended the call, started her car, and drove home through afternoon light that seemed surreal after the long darkness. Her apartment building looked exactly as she'd left it, ordinary, peaceful, unchanged by events that had transformed everything else. She showered, scrubbing away the smell of police stations and federal buildings and injustice, watching blood and exhaustion swirl down the drain. Her wrist showed bruising where the handcuffs had been, purple shadows that would fade but leave memory. Sleep should have come easily after 36 hours of consciousness, but her mind kept replaying details. Vance's sneer, Morrison's gradual realization, Santos's tears, Chen's professional competence, the machine of justice finally, belatedly engaging. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Deputy Santos. I know I have no right to ask, but if you need anything, testimony for other victims, someone to verify department patterns, anything, please call. I want to help fix this." Lena saved the number, typed a brief response. "Thank you. I'll be in touch." Another message, this one from the hospital director. "Take whatever time you need. Your job is secure, and we're implementing the protocols you recommended. Thank you for your service, both military and medical." The sun was setting again, another cycle complete when Lena finally slept. Her dreams were not gentle. They never were. Not after Afghanistan, not after years of trauma surgery, not after nights like this one. But they were at least her own, experienced in safety rather than handcuffs. She woke to news alerts that Mitchell County Sheriff's Department was under federal investigation, that a veteran officer had been suspended pending civil rights violation charges, that victims of questionable arrests were being encouraged to come forward. The story was local for now, but Chen had warned her it might go national depending on what the investigation uncovered. Her phone showed 47 missed messages, reporters requesting interviews, victim advocacy groups offering support, former military colleagues checking in, the Pentagon liaison confirming her security clearance remained intact and asking if she needed anything. And one message from a number with a Montana area code. "This is Sarah Chen, truck driver. Federal agent said you might remember me from gas station. I saw what happened. I'm sorry I didn't stop. I'll testify to whatever helps." Lena stared at that message for a long time, at the apology from a stranger who'd looked away because intervening had seemed dangerous. She understood it, had done similar calculations in war zones and hospitals, the math of survival versus heroism. But she also understood that systems of abuse depended on that calculation, on witnesses choosing safety over involvement. She typed carefully. "Thank you for coming forward now. Your testimony will help. No judgment for earlier. I understand the fear." The response came quickly. "You weren't afraid. I watched you stand there, calm as anything, like you knew help was coming." "How did you know?" Lena considered her answer, thinking about training and clearances and the specific privileges that came from military service, from knowing exactly who to call when civilian systems failed. "I didn't know. I hoped. And I had resources most people don't have. That's what we're trying to fix." Her next shift at Silver Ridge Medical wasn't for 3 days, which gave her time to process, to meet with federal investigators, to begin planning how to transform personal injustice into systemic change. Chen had asked her to consult on training protocols, and she'd agreed immediately, already drafting ideas for how to teach medical professionals to document, report, and escalate when law enforcement overstepped. But first, she had one more call to make. She dialed the Pentagon liaison officer who'd taken her emergency call, waded through encrypted routing, and heard the same professional voice that had promised help in her worst moment. "Staff Sergeant Brooks. Status update? Safe. Statement given. Federal investigation ongoing." Lena paused. "I wanted to thank you for believing me, for acting immediately, for treating an emergency call like an actual emergency." "Marines take care of Marines," the officer said simply. "But I have to ask, did you ever doubt? When you made that call, standing in a sheriff's station in the middle of nowhere, did you think maybe the system wouldn't work?" "Honestly, yes. I thought maybe protocols had changed. Maybe my clearance had expired. Maybe I'd just end up in a cell making phone calls that went nowhere. She looked at the bruises on her wrists already fading. But I also thought it was worth trying, because if the system worked even once, it might work for other people. And if it didn't work, at least I'd have tried everything before accepting defeat. That's the right attitude. And for the record, your call triggered the fastest emergency response we've processed in 6 months. You hit every protocol perfectly, authenticated immediately, gave precise location and threat assessment. We train people for years to make calls that good under stress. 12 years of military service buys some useful skills. It does, but it also buys something else, credibility. When you called, we knew you weren't panicking or exaggerating. We knew if Staff Sergeant Lena Brooks said she was being illegally detained, that's exactly what was happening. That credibility saved hours of verification and got agents to your location fast enough to make a difference. After the call ended, Lena sat in her apartment as night fell again, thinking about credibility and privilege and the infrastructure of justice that worked sometimes for some people under specific circumstances. She thought about the 17 confirmed victims who hadn't had her training or clearances or knowledge, who'd accepted plea deals and paid fines and carried conviction records for crimes that existed only in Derek Vance's imagination. And she thought about the person she'd been 12 hours ago. Exhausted nurse, recent veteran, someone trying to build a civilian life after years of service, and the person she was now. Witness, advocate, catalyst for change she'd never sought but couldn't abandon. Her phone buzzed one more time. Federal Agent Chen. Press conference tomorrow, 2 p.m. We're announcing the investigation publicly and encouraging other victims to come forward. You don't have to attend, but if you choose to, your presence would send a powerful message. Your decision. Lena stared at the message, considering implications. Public meant exposure, meant reporters and cameras, and her face attached to a story that would follow her. But public also meant accountability, meant other victims seeing that someone had fought and won, meant systems of abuse losing their most powerful weapon. Silence. She typed her response. I'll be there. Outside her window, the Nevada night sparkled with stars that didn't care about human justice or injustice, systems that worked or failed, Marines who made phone calls or deputies who abused authority. The stars just existed, indifferent and eternal, while below them people made choices that rippled outward in ways that could destroy lives or save them. Lena Brooks chose to stand up, walk to her closet, and select the outfit she'd wear to tomorrow's press conference. Not scrub stained with blood, not the exhausted civilian who'd been stopped at a gas station, but the uniform she'd earned through 12 years of service, ribbons and medals, and the kind of authority that came from sacrifice rather than intimidation. If Mitchell County was going to learn about the woman Derek Vance had tried to break, they would learn about all of her. Nurse and Marine, victim and advocate, someone who'd made one phone call and changed everything. The uniform still fit perfectly, muscle memory guiding her hands through the familiar ritual of buttons and creases that had to align exactly right. Navy blue jacket, service ribbons arranged in precise rows, the eagle globe and anchor gleaming under her apartment's fluorescent light. Lena hadn't worn her dress blues since her retirement ceremony 3 years ago, but fabric and protocol remembered even when conscious thought faltered. She studied herself in the mirror, not the exhausted nurse from 48 hours ago, not the handcuffed victim in a sheriff's station, but Staff Sergeant Lena Brooks, USMC, intelligence specialist with 3 combat deployments and a chest full of commendations that told stories she'd never speak aloud. The transformation was deliberate, tactical, a weapon chosen specifically for the battle ahead. Her phone showed 1:47 p.m. The press conference started at 2. Chen had texted the address. Mitchell County Courthouse, the same building where Derek Vance had presumably testified in countless cases, where judges had accepted his word as gospel, where the machinery of justice had functioned exactly as designed to process people who lacked resources to fight back. The courthouse steps were crowded when she arrived. News vans from Reno and Carson City competing for position. Local reporters who'd covered nothing more serious than county fairs suddenly handed a federal investigation with national implications. Cameras turned as she approached, the uniform drawing attention before recognition clicked. A young reporter, maybe 25, local station, eager enough to be brave, stepped forward with microphone extended. "Excuse me, are you Lena Brooks, the nurse who was arrested?" "I'm Lena Brooks," she confirmed, not stopping, not slowing. "Former Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Currently employed as trauma nurse at Silver Ridge Medical Center. And yes, I was illegally detained by Officer Derek Vance 3 nights ago. Can you tell us what happened?" "I'll be making a statement inside." Lena moved past with the kind of polite finality that discouraged follow-up questions, her bearing communicating that interviews happened on her terms or not at all. Federal Agent Chen waited just inside the courthouse doors, his expression approving as he registered her choice of uniform. "Staff Sergeant, glad you could make it. The other victims are already here, 17 confirmed, another 8 who came forward after the news broke yesterday. They're nervous. Understandable. They don't have federal agents and DOD backing them." "No, but they have you." Chen gestured toward a conference room where voices murmured with the particular anxiety of people who'd been wronged and were finally terrifyingly being asked to speak about it publicly. "A lot of them saw your name in the news, saw that you fought back and won. It gave them courage. You want to meet them before we start?" Lena nodded, following him into a room where 25 people sat in various states of distress and determination. Women mostly, ranging from early 20s to late 50s, though 3 men occupied chairs in the back row. Every demographic was represented: white, black, Hispanic, Asian, rich, and poor, and everything between. The only commonality being that they'd all encountered Derek Vance on dark highways and survived to tell about it. Conversation died as Lena entered, every eye tracking to her uniform, the visible proof that she was exactly who the news reports claimed. A woman in her 30s, Hispanic, tired eyes, hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was a life preserver, spoke first. "You're really her? The Marine who got him arrested?" "I'm really her. But I didn't get him arrested. You did. Your complaints, your documentation, your willingness to come forward now. I just made a phone call that forced people to pay attention to evidence that was already there. That's more than the rest of us managed." This from a black woman, maybe 50, wearing a church Sunday best that suggested she'd dressed for court the way soldiers dressed for battle. "I filed a complaint 2 years ago. Nobody even called me back." "They will now," Agent Reeves said from the doorway, tablet in hand, expression grimly satisfied. "We've pulled every complaint filed against Vance in the last decade. Every traffic stop, every arrest, every use of force report. The pattern is undeniable, and it's all going into federal prosecution." A young man, white, college age, nervous, raised his hand like he was still in classroom rather than conference room. "What if we don't want to testify? I mean, I want him punished, but going public—" "Your choice entirely," Chen assured him. "Some cases will proceed based on documentation alone. But if you're willing to testify, it strengthens everything. It transforms statistics into human faces, pattern into personal harm." "Will he go to prison?" The question came from the woman who'd spoken first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lived in fear of Vance's retaliation for months or years. "If we do our jobs right, yes." Reeves didn't soften it, didn't offer false comfort. Civil rights violations under color of law carry federal sentences. He's looking at minimum 5 years, potentially 15 if we prove conspiracy or pattern of practice. And he'll never work in law enforcement again. The room absorbed this with mixed reactions: satisfaction, relief, residual fear that even prison wouldn't be enough to balance what he'd taken from them. Lena recognized the expressions from Afghanistan, from villages where justice arrived too late to undo damage, but early enough to prevent future harm. 2 minutes, an aide announced from the hallway. Press is assembled. Cameras are live. The victims filed out slowly, moving toward a courtroom that had been converted into press conference venue, where Sheriff Hardwick would stand beside federal agents and admit his department's catastrophic failures. Lena waited until the room emptied before following, Chen falling into step beside her. "You don't have to speak," he said quietly. "Your presence is enough. The uniform, your record, the visual of a decorated veteran who was victimized by the system, that tells the story without words." "I know, but I'm speaking anyway." The courtroom was packed beyond legal capacity, reporters and cameras and concerned citizens who'd followed the story from initial arrest through federal investigation. Judge's bench empty, witness stand cleared, the usual theater of justice replaced by podium and microphones that would carry words beyond Mitchell County, beyond Nevada, into national consciousness where police accountability was debated with religious fervor and zero consensus. Sheriff Hardwick stood at the podium looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His uniform pressed, but his face haggard, the physical manifestation of an institution confronting its own rot. Beside him, Agent Chen and Agent Reeves represented federal authority with the kind of calm that came from handling worse scandals in bigger jurisdictions. "Thank you for coming," Hardwick began, his voice rough but steady. 3 days ago, a decorated military veteran and respected medical professional was illegally detained by a member of my department. That detention violated multiple civil rights statutes, department protocols, and basic human decency. I'm here to take responsibility for systemic failures that allowed this to happen and to announce comprehensive reforms that will prevent future occurrences. Cameras clicked, reporters typed, the machinery of public accountability spinning up with familiar efficiency. Lena stood to the side, close enough to be clearly visible, but not yet center stage, letting Hardwick own his failures before she claimed her vindication. "Officer Derek Vance has been suspended without pay pending federal criminal prosecution," Hardwick continued. "He is currently in federal custody facing charges of civil rights violations, deprivation of rights under color of law, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Additionally, we have identified 25 individuals who were potentially victimized by similar conduct over a 10-year period. The Department of Justice will be reviewing all cases for possible appeals, expungement, or compensation." A reporter from the Reno Gazette shouted a question. "Sheriff, did you know about Vance's pattern of abuse before this incident?" Hardwick's jaw tightened. "I knew there had been complaints. I did not know or chose not to see the pattern those complaints represented. That's a failure of leadership, and I accept full responsibility." "Will you resign?" "That decision will be made by the county board after reviewing DOJ findings. But my priority right now isn't protecting my job. It's protecting the people Vance hurt and making sure this never happens again." Agent Chen stepped to the podium, his federal authority superseding local politics. "The Department of Justice takes these violations extremely seriously. We're implementing a consent decree requiring comprehensive reforms, mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight board, bias training, and independent review of all use of force incidents. Mitchell County Sheriff's Department will be audited quarterly until compliance is absolute." "How did this come to your attention?" A different reporter, younger, female, her question directed at Chen, but her eyes on Lena. "The victim in the initial incident is a former Marine Corps intelligence specialist with active security clearance. She utilized emergency DOD protocols to report illegal detention, which triggered immediate federal response." Chen's tone made it clear this was exceptional circumstance rather than standard procedure. "Most victims don't have access to those resources, which is exactly why systemic oversight is necessary." "Can we hear from the victim?" Chen turned, gesture inviting but not demanding. Lena stepped forward, the movement bringing her into direct camera view, her uniform and bearing impossible to ignore. The room's energy shifted perceptibly, curiosity transforming into something more complex. Respect, recognition, the awareness that this was not the usual victim of police overreach. She took the podium without notes, without prepared remarks, trusting years of briefing superior officers to guide her through hostile terrain of public speaking. "My name is Lena Marie Brooks. I served 12 years in the United States Marine Corps as intelligence specialist, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. I was honorably discharged in 2021 and now work as trauma nurse at Silver Ridge Medical Center." Her voice carried clearly, parade ground projection filling the courtroom without shouting. 3 nights ago, I finished a 12-hour shift where I helped save 3 lives. I stopped for gas on my way home. I was detained by Officer Derek Vance without probable cause, denied timely access to legal communication, threatened with fabricated charges, and subjected to treatment designed to intimidate me into accepting guilt for crimes I did not commit. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. The victims sitting in the front row watched with expressions mixing awe and vindication, seeing their own experiences validated by someone the system couldn't easily dismiss. I was able to resist because of training, because of resources, Because I knew exactly who to call when local systems failed. Lena paused, letting that sink in. But most people don't have that knowledge. Most people faced with Officer Vance's abuse accepted plea deals, paid fines, carried conviction records, because fighting seemed impossible and the cost of resistance was too high. She gestured to the victims. These 25 people represent courage. They filed complaints that were ignored. They spoke up when silence would have been easier. They maintained their truth despite a system that told them their truth didn't matter. And they're here today because one phone call finally forced that system to listen. What do you want people to know about what happened? The question came from a national news correspondent, someone whose face Lena vaguely recognized from evening broadcasts. I want people to know that this wasn't one bad officer. This was a system that empowered abuse, ignored complaints, and prioritized institutional loyalty over justice. Sheriff Hardwick is being honest about his failures, and I respect that, but honesty without action is just confession. Real reform requires changing structures that allow people like Derek Vance to victimize dozens before facing any consequences. Movement in the back of the courtroom drew her attention. A door opening, revealing Derek Vance himself, flanked by federal marshals, dressed in civilian clothes rather than uniform, his earlier swagger completely absent. He'd been brought for arraignment, his timing unfortunate or perhaps deliberately calculated by prosecutors who wanted him to hear exactly what his victims had to say. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Vance looked away first. I also want people to know, Lena continued, her voice hardening slightly, that power without accountability is just tyranny with a badge. Officer Vance believed he could act with impunity because he'd done so for years. He was wrong. And anyone else wearing a uniform who thinks their authority exempts them from consequences needs to understand. There are still people who fight back. There are still systems that work, however imperfectly. And there are still consequences for those who abuse the trust placed in them. The press conference continued for another 40 minutes, other victims sharing stories that ranged from harassment to outright assault, each testimony adding weight to a case that was already overwhelming. Federal agents outlined prosecution timelines. Sheriff Hardwick announced immediate policy changes. Local politicians made speeches about accountability and reform that might or might not survive contact with actual governance. But the moment that would dominate news cycles, that would be clipped and shared and referenced in future discussions of police accountability, was Lena in full dress blues making eye contact with the man who'd arrested her while calmly explaining exactly how his abuse of power had triggered his own destruction. Afterward, in a private conference room away from cameras and questions, Agent Reeves pulled up preliminary findings on her tablet. We've got him on at least 34 civil rights violations spanning 9 years. That's just what we can prove with documentation. Victim testimony adds another 12 cases with enough evidence to prosecute. Will all of them testify? Lena asked. 17 definitely, 5 probably, 3 still deciding. Reeves scrolled through names and case summaries. The ones deciding are worried about retaliation. Vance still has friends in the department, still has family in the county. They're not wrong to be worried. What about witness protection? For a civil rights case, DOJ doesn't usually authorize that level of resource expenditure. Chen joined them, carrying coffee that smelled significantly better than the courthouse machine could produce. But we can arrange security details, restraining orders, relocation assistance if necessary. Nobody testifies without protection. Sheriff Hardwick appeared in the doorway, hesitant, clearly aware that his presence might not be welcome. Ms. Brooks, could I have a moment? Lena nodded permission. Chen and Reeves withdrew discreetly, leaving them alone in a room that suddenly felt smaller. I wanted you to hear this directly, not through official channels, Hardwick said. I'm recommending to the county board that they accept my resignation effective end of month. This happened on my watch, and I should have seen it. I should have stopped it years ago. You're right. You should have. Lena didn't soften it, didn't offer comfort he hadn't earned. But resignation is easier than reform. You leave, someone new comes in. Maybe things change or maybe they don't. You staying and fixing this, that's harder. That requires accountability beyond the performative kind. Hardwick looked surprised, like he'd expected her to demand his resignation rather than challenge him to earn redemption. You want me to stay? I want the department fixed. If you can do that better than your replacement, then yes, stay. If you're just protecting your pension and hoping this blows over, then leave and let someone else try. She met his eyes steadily. But understand, I'll be watching. The victims will be watching. Federal oversight will be watching. And if reforms don't happen, if this becomes bureaucratic theater instead of real change, we will know and we will act. I understand. Do you? Because here's what real reform looks like. You fire every deputy who enabled Vance. You implement independent review of every complaint, not internal affairs investigating their own. You bring in community representatives who actually reflect Mitchell County's demographics, not just the people who vote in your elections. And you create whistleblower protections strong enough that deputies like Santos can speak up without destroying their careers. Hardwick pulled out a notepad, started writing. What else? Mandatory recording of all traffic stops, not just when convenient. Quarterly publication of stop data broken down by race, gender, time, location. Let community organizations analyze patterns you might miss or ignore. An external oversight with actual enforcement power, not advisory boards that make recommendations you can ignore. That's going to be expensive. The county board will fund it or face federal intervention, Agent Chen said from the doorway, having returned to check on the conversation. Sheriff, we're not suggesting reforms. We're mandating them as part of the consent decree. The only question is whether you implement them voluntarily or whether we impose them through court order. Hardwick nodded slowly, political calculation meeting legal reality. Then I'll implement them, and I'll stay long enough to see them working, to prove this wasn't just crisis management. After he left, Lena sank into a chair, adrenaline from the press conference finally catching up with exhaustion that 3 days of chaos hadn't fully processed. Chen sat across from her, expression shifting from federal agent to something more human. You did good out there, he said. Press is already running with it. Decorated veteran exposes police corruption. Federal investigation follows. This is going to have legs beyond Mitchell County. That's what worries me. Lena rubbed her temples where headache was building. I didn't want to be a story. I wanted to drive home from work, sleep in my own bed, maybe watch bad television before my next shift. You got Derek Vance instead. I got Derek Vance and 25 other victims, and a federal investigation and reporters who now have my name and face and service record. My quiet civilian life just got significantly less quiet. True. Chen didn't argue, didn't minimize. But you also got justice. For yourself and for people who'd given up on getting any. That counts for something. Lena's phone buzzed. Message from the hospital director requesting meeting to discuss her security and continued employment. Another from a legal advocacy group offering pro bono representation for any civil suit she wanted to file. A third from a publisher asking about book rights to her story. She silenced the phone without reading further. What happens next? She asked. Legally. Grand jury indictment probably within 2 weeks. Vance will be arraigned, bail will be set high given flight risk and federal charges. Trial timeline depends on whether he pleads out or fights. My guess is plea. His lawyer will look at the evidence and recommend cutting losses. And if he doesn't plead, then we go to trial, which means you testify, other victims testify, and everything gets aired in public with even more media coverage than today. Chen's expression suggested he knew which outcome she'd prefer. For what it's worth, I think he pleads. His union lawyer is competent enough to recognize unwinnable cases. Agent Reeves joined them, her tablet showing news coverage already spreading across regional outlets with national pickups imminent. CBS is requesting interview, so is NPR, Washington Post, and about 15 other major outlets. What do you want me to tell them? Tell them I'll consider requests after the legal proceedings conclude. Lena stood, her dress blues suddenly feeling heavy despite the lightweight fabric. I'm not interested in being professional victim or poster child for police reform. I made a statement today because it needed making. That doesn't obligate me to endless interviews about the worst night of my civilian life. Fair enough. Reeves made notes. What about the advocacy groups? There are several organizations that want to feature your case in campaigns about police accountability, veteran rights, protecting medical professionals. Same answer. After legal proceedings conclude, I'll consider what feels right. Lena moved toward the door, needing air and space and distance from institutional walls. Right now I need to go home, change out of this uniform, and remember what normal feels like before I forget entirely." The courthouse steps were still crowded, though the press conference had ended an hour ago. Cameras tracked Lena's exit, several reporters moving to intercept before Chen and Reeves flanked her with the kind of professional intimidation that discouraged approach without requiring verbal warning. A woman broke through anyway, late 50s, civilian clothes, expression determined enough to override fear of federal agents. "Ms. Brooks, please, just one question." Chen moved to block her, but Lena held up a hand. Something in the woman's face suggested this wasn't reporter curiosity, but personal stake. "My daughter," the woman said, words tumbling out quickly like she expected to be cut off any second. "Vance arrested her 4 years ago. Drug possession, completely fabricated. She took a plea deal because we couldn't afford a lawyer, and now she has a conviction record that's destroyed her career opportunities. Can she appeal? Can this be fixed?" "What's your daughter's name?" "Jessica Moreno." The arrest was April 2022, Mitchell County. Agent Reeves was already pulling up records on her tablet, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Jessica Moreno, age 24 at time of arrest, charged with possession of methamphetamine, pled guilty to reduced charges, sentenced to probation, and community service. She looked up. Officer of record was Derek Vance. This fits the pattern. "Then, yes," Lena said to the mother whose desperation was visible in every line of her face. "Contact the Department of Justice Victim Assistance Line. Agent Reeves will give you the number. They're reviewing all of Vance's cases for potential appeals and expungement. Your daughter should qualify." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. God bless you. Thank you." She disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Lena with the uncomfortable awareness that 25 confirmed victims was almost certainly low estimate, that Vance's pattern of abuse had rippled outward through families and communities in ways that would take years to fully document. "How many do you think there really are?" she asked Chen as they walked to her car. "Conservatively? 60 to 70 over the decade he was active. Realistically? Maybe 100, maybe more. Some victims won't come forward out of fear, shame, or just wanting to move on. Some cases won't have enough documentation to prove. Some people he targeted are probably dead or gone, their stories lost to time and trauma. And he would have kept going if I hadn't made that phone call. Yes, for another 10 years, 20, however long until retirement or death or someone else with resources finally stopped him. Ba Chen stopped at her Honda, the same vehicle that had been evidence 3 days ago and was now just transportation. "That's not on you to carry. You didn't create Derek Vance. You just had the tools and courage to stop him." Lena climbed into her car, started the engine, and sat for a moment letting reality settle. The gas station where this began was visible from the courthouse parking lot, its flickering lights and familiar pumps looking surreal now that she knew what they represented. Inflection point between quiet life and public consequence, between victim and catalyst. Her phone rang. Unknown number, but she answered anyway, half expecting another reporter or advocacy organization. Instead, a male voice, older, official sounding. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, this is Colonel Marcus Webb, Marine Corps Veteran Affairs. I'm calling to check on your welfare following the incident in Mitchell County and to inform you that your actions have been noted by DOD Command. If you need any support, medical, legal, financial, psychological, you are entitled to full veteran benefits and services." "Thank you, sir. I'm managing." "I'm sure you are. Marines generally do." A pause, then his tone shifted slightly, becoming less official and more personal. "Off the record, what you did, calling in when systems failed, standing up publicly, using your training to protect yourself and others, that's exactly what we hope every veteran carries into civilian life. You've made the Corps proud." The call ended before Lena could formulate response, leaving her staring at her phone and blinking against unexpected tears. She'd left active duty 3 years ago, had thought that chapter closed. Identity shifted from Marine to nurse in the same way combat zones became hospital wards. But apparently some identities didn't close cleanly, some training stayed active regardless of discharge papers, and some communities remained family even in civilian clothes. She drove home through late afternoon traffic, the mundane flow of normal life continuing around her like nothing had changed. People going to jobs, picking up kids, running errands, existing in the comfortable assumption that law enforcement served rather than threatened them. For most of Mitchell County, Derek Vance's arrest was scandal and gossip, not personal trauma that would reshape their relationship with authority. Her apartment building looked exactly as she'd left it that morning. Ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of place where decorated veterans and trauma nurses lived quiet lives between shifts. Except now reporters knew her address, federal agents had her direct number, and her face was spreading across news outlets with headlines about corruption and accountability and decorated Marines who refused to be victims. Lena changed out of her dress blues carefully, hanging the uniform with the same precision she'd used putting it on, ritual bookending a day that had transformed her from private citizen to public figure. Her civilian clothes felt strange afterward, like costume rather than authentic expression. Her identity caught between who she'd been and who circumstances were forcing her to become. She was staring into her refrigerator, contemplating whether exhaustion or hunger would win this round, when someone knocked on her door. She checked the peephole. Deputy Santos, out of uniform, looking nervous and determined in equal measure. Lena opened the door cautiously. Deputy Santos. "Just Maria, please. I'm off duty, and I'm not here officially." Santos held up her hands, showing they were empty, no weapon visible. "I wanted to apologize in person, not just through text, and to tell you that 6 more deputies have come forward with information about Vance's pattern. We're cooperating fully with federal investigation." "Come in." Santos entered carefully, taking in the apartment's sparse decoration. Few personal items, no photographs, the transient quality of someone who'd learned not to get attached to places. "You live like military housing, like you might deploy tomorrow." "Old habits." Lena gestured to the couch, took the chair opposite. "You said 6 more deputies came forward?" "Yes. We've been talking, comparing notes, realizing how much we collectively knew that individually we'd dismissed as rumor or exaggeration." Santos's hands twisted together, knuckle-cracking, betraying stress that her voice tried to hide. "I keep thinking about my cousin, about how easily I accepted Vance's version rather than hers. Family, and I still chose the badge over truth. You're choosing differently now. 3 years late, after dozens of victims, after you had to make a federal case just to be believed." Santos looked up, meeting Lena's eyes directly. "I want to help fix this. Whatever that takes, testimony, documentation, working with Reform Committee. I owe you that much. I owe all the victims that much." "Then start by answering a question honestly," Lena said. "How many deputies knew, not suspected, not rumored, knew that Vance was abusing authority and did nothing?" Santos was quiet for a long moment. 10, maybe 12, out of a department of 35. A third of the force. Yes. Some actively helped, providing backup on suspicious stops, corroborating stories, discouraging complaints. Others just looked away, didn't ask questions they didn't want answered. She swallowed hard. "I was in the second group. Never helped directly, but never stopped it either. That makes me complicit." "It does," Lena agreed without softening. "But complicity has degrees. The question is what you do now, whether you protect the system or help dismantle its worst parts." "I want to help dismantle, even if it costs me my job. It might cost more than that. Deputies who participated actively will likely face charges. Those who enabled passively might avoid prosecution, but not consequences. Careers will end. Reputations will be destroyed. People you worked beside for years will hate you for speaking up." "I know." Santos's voice was steady despite the tears tracking down her face. "But I've spent 3 years hating myself for staying quiet while my cousin paid for crimes she didn't commit. That's worse than any consequence the department can impose." Lena studied her, assessing sincerity versus performative guilt, parsing whether Santos represented genuine reform or political calculation. Finally, she pulled out her phone, found Agent Chen's number, and sent a brief text. "Deputy Maria Santos, ready to provide comprehensive testimony. Recommend full cooperation agreement and whistleblower protection." The response came within seconds. "Bring her in tomorrow, 9 a.m. We'll make it official." "You're going to testify," Lena said. "All of it. Everything you know, names and details, and the whole corrupt infrastructure. Agent Chen will protect you legally, but you need to understand, this will change your life permanently. My life needs changing. Santos stood, wiping her eyes, but not apologizing for the tears. Thank you for giving me a chance to get it right, even if it's years too late. After Santos left, Lena sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, not bothering with lights, letting evening shadows fill spaces that felt too empty for the magnitude of everything happening. Her phone showed 47 new messages, more reporters, more advocacy groups, messages from former military colleagues who'd seen the news, texts from hospital coworkers offering support, and one message from a number she didn't recognize but that carried a Virginia area code. This is Colonel Webb again. Unofficial follow-up to earlier call. DoD is monitoring the Mitchell County situation closely. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you have resources available that go beyond standard veteran services. We take care of our own, especially when civilian systems fail them. Lena stared at that message, reading between its official language to the promise underneath, that she wasn't alone, that institutional power could be marshaled in her defense, that the same military infrastructure she'd served would protect her if necessary. It was simultaneously comforting and terrifying, reminder that she'd triggered mechanisms far larger than one corrupt cop or one small county. She finally turned on lights, microwaved food she barely tasted, and tried to pretend tonight was normal. But normal had died 3 nights ago in handcuffs at a gas station, and whatever emerged from federal investigation and prosecution and reform wouldn't resemble the quiet civilian life she'd built after Afghanistan. Her shift at Silver Ridge Medical started in 18 hours. She was supposed to return to trauma rotation like nothing had changed, to compress arteries and titrate medications and make split-second decisions while cameras clicked outside and reporters requested interviews and her face appeared on evening news as symbol of something larger than herself. The hospital director's message was waiting in her email when she finally checked. Take medical leave if needed. Your position is secure regardless of legal proceedings duration. We support you completely and are implementing transport protocols you recommended. You've already made this hospital safer. Lena typed brief response. Thank you. I'll be at my shift tomorrow. Saving lives is better therapy than sitting home watching news coverage. She tried to sleep, managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful unconsciousness interrupted by dreams, where Derek Vance wore different faces, but the pattern remained constant. Authority without accountability, power without conscience, victims ignored until one finally refused to be silent. She woke at 4 a.m., gave up on further sleep, and went for a run through streets where dawn was still hours away. The physical exertion helped, muscle fatigue overriding mental exhaustion. Letting her body do what her mind couldn't, shut down the replay loop of press conferences and testimonies and federal agents promising justice that came too late for too many people. The emergency room at Silver Ridge Medical Center operated on its own chaotic rhythm, immune to external dramas like federal investigations or decorated veterans returning to work after becoming national news. A 40-car pileup on Interstate 80 had transformed the trauma bay into controlled pandemonium, every bed occupied, doctors shouting orders, nurses moving with the choreographed precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. Lena slipped into the rhythm like she'd never left, muscle memory overriding everything else. IV lines established, wounds assessed, vitals monitored, the fundamental mathematics of emergency medicine where seconds determined whether patients lived or died. A teenager with compound femur fracture, a trucker with internal bleeding, a mother shielding her daughter, both with lacerations but alive because one person had made the right choice in the wrong moment. Brooks, I need you on the GSW in Bay 4. Doctor. Sarah Martinez called over the organized chaos, not acknowledging the cameras visible through the ER's front windows or the reporters who'd tried to follow Lena inside before security intervened. Gunshot wound to the abdomen, pressures dropping, OR is backed up 30 minutes. Lena moved immediately, the patient's emergency overriding her own complications. The victim was male, early 20s, Hispanic, bleeding from a wound that had likely nicked his liver based on location and presentation. She applied pressure, established lines, started fluids while Martinez assessed damage with hands that had performed this evaluation too many times. We can't wait 30 minutes, Martinez said flatly. He'll exsanguinate before OR is available. Then we stabilize here, and transport to Carson City Medical. Lena was already calculating 40-minute drive, possible complications en route, but better odds than bleeding out waiting for available surgical suite. I can ride with him, maintain pressure, keep him viable until transfer. Do it. Martinez moved to the next crisis, trusting Lena's judgment the way combat medics trusted each other when choices meant life or death. The ambulance ride to Carson City gave Lena 40 minutes of focus that had nothing to do with press conferences or Derek Vance or federal investigations. Just a young man whose name was Eduardo, whose vitals kept threatening to crash, whose mother followed in a separate vehicle praying to saints that might or might not be listening, but definitely wouldn't help as much as Lena's hands maintaining pressure on wounds that wanted to kill him. She kept him alive. Barely, but barely was enough when the alternative was death notification and family members screaming questions that had no good answers. The Carson City surgical team took over with grateful efficiency, Eduardo's odds improving exponentially once he reached actual operating theater. Lena caught a ride back to Silver Ridge with a supply truck, using the time to finally check her phone, which had accumulated messages with the relentless intensity of an avalanche. Most were routine, reporters requesting interviews, advocacy groups offering platforms, the usual noise that accompanied unwanted visibility. But 3 messages demanded immediate attention. First, from Agent Chen. Grand jury returned indictment. Vance arraigned this morning, bail denied due to flight risk and evidence tampering concerns. He's in federal custody pending trial. Prosecution timeline accelerated. DOJ wants this resolved quickly and publicly. Second, from Sheriff Hardwick. Internal Affairs completed preliminary review. 12 deputies implicated in enabling Vance's conduct, 4 actively participated. Termination proceedings initiated. Criminal referrals filed. Reform implementation beginning immediately. You were right, staying and fixing this is harder than resigning. Third, from an unknown number with Mitchell County area code. This is Judge Patricia Morrison, 8th Judicial District. I presided over 17 cases involving Derek Vance's testimony. I'm reviewing all of them for potential judicial misconduct. I need to speak with you regarding patterns you may have observed. This is not optional. Lena read that last message 3 times, parsing implications. Judge Morrison, no relation to the desk sergeant, was requesting meeting not as courtesy but as legal requirement, which meant she'd found something in those 17 cases that demanded victim input. Something bad enough that a sitting judge was voluntarily opening herself to scrutiny and potential consequences. She texted back, "Available tomorrow between shifts, where and when?" The response came within minutes. "My chambers, 2 p.m., come alone, attorney not required but permitted if you choose. This conversation stays confidential until I determine appropriate next steps." The supply truck dropped Lena at Silver Ridge just as the day shift was transitioning to night. The ER finally clearing after the pileups controlled chaos. Dr. Martinez found her in the locker room, exhaustion evident but satisfaction deeper. Eduardo's out of surgery, stable, prognosis good. Martinez sat heavily on the bench, scrubs showing the arterial spray pattern that came from emergency procedures. "You saved his life. His mother wanted me to tell you she's praying for you, which I know isn't your thing, but the sentiment's real. Tell her I'm glad Eduardo's alive and that prayer didn't hurt." Lena changed scrubs, the blood-stained set going into biohazard disposal. "How bad is it outside?" The reporters. "Hospital security has them corralled in the parking lot. They can't approach staff or patients per legal requirements, but they're persistent. Administration is fielding interview requests and will continue deflecting until you say otherwise." Martinez's expression shifted to something more personal. "For what it's worth, every doctor and nurse in this ER has your back. What Vance did was unconscionable, and watching you handle it with that much grace while still showing up for shifts and saving lives, that's impressive as hell. I'm just doing my job. You're doing everyone's job and somehow making it look easy." Martinez stood, stretching muscles that had been stressed past reasonable limits. "Take tomorrow off if you need it. The federal stuff, the judge meetings, the whole circus, that's a lot to handle while also trying to be a trauma nurse. Tomorrow I can handle. It's the weeks after that worry me." Lena pulled on clean scrubs, muscle memory making the routine automatic. "This isn't going away. The trial, the testimony, the reforms, it's going to be months of this, maybe years. Then we adjust. You work when you can, take time when you need it, and we cover the gaps because that's what teams do. Martinez headed for the door, paused. And Lena? What you did, making that phone call, standing up publicly, that doesn't just matter for Mitchell County. Every nurse who transports medications, every veteran who wonders if their service means anything, every person who's been abused by authority and told their truth doesn't matter, they're all watching. You're showing them that fighting back is possible. That matters more than you probably realize. After Martinez left, Lena sat in the empty locker room processing words that felt too heavy, responsibilities she'd never sought but couldn't abandon. Her phone buzzed. Message from Agent Reeves with attachment labeled Preliminary Case Summary, Confidential. She opened it despite the warning, scanning 50 pages of documentation that represented Derek Vance's complete destruction. 34 civil rights violations with documented evidence, 12 cases of evidence tampering, 8 instances of perjury in sworn testimony, pattern of practice findings that implicated not just Vance but the institutional structures that enabled him. And buried in the summary, a section that made Lena's blood run cold. Additional investigation revealed financial irregularities suggesting Vance received payments from 3 suspects in exchange for favorable testimony or evidence suppression. This elevates charges to include bribery, corruption, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Federal prosecution now estimates maximum sentence of 25 years. Vance hadn't just been a bully with a badge. He'd been actively corrupt, selling his authority to the highest bidder while simultaneously brutalizing the most vulnerable. The scope of his criminality kept expanding, each new revelation adding layers to damage that would take years to fully comprehend. The next morning, Lena drove to the 8th Judicial District Courthouse, a different building from where the press conference had occurred. This one housing civil proceedings and judicial chambers where careers were made or destroyed through rulings that rarely made headlines. Judge Morrison's secretary escorted her through secured corridors to chambers that smelled like old books and furniture polish, where the trappings of authority created atmosphere of careful deliberation. Judge Patricia Morrison was 60-something, black, with the kind of face that suggested she'd been hearing lies from lawyers and cops for decades, and had developed sophisticated bullshit detection as survival mechanism. She stood when Lena entered, offering a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. Staff Sergeant Brooks, thank you for coming. Morrison gestured to a leather chair across from her desk. I've reviewed 17 cases where Derek Vance provided testimony that substantially influenced my rulings. Of those 17, 12 resulted in convictions based primarily or exclusively on his credibility as law enforcement officer. Lena sat, recognizing this wasn't conversation but confession, judge admitting she'd been deceived and was trying to determine how to address consequences. And now you know his credibility was fraudulent. Worse than fraudulent, actively malicious. Morrison pulled up files on her computer, turning the screen so Lena could see. Look at the pattern. Every defendant Vance arrested was either minority, female, or economically disadvantaged. Every charge involved substances or situations where physical evidence could be ambiguous. And every conviction came after plea deals where defendants accepted guilt rather than risk trial. Because they couldn't afford lawyers or couldn't risk losing income fighting charges. Exactly. And I accepted Vance's testimony without sufficient scrutiny because he was an experienced officer with clean record and no prior complaints that reached my desk. Morrison's jaw tightened. Except there were complaints, dozens. They were just filtered through department processes that ensured judges never saw patterns that might cause us to question law enforcement credibility. What are you going to do about it? I'm vacating all 12 convictions effective immediately. I'm ordering expungement of arrest records, return of fines and fees paid, and I'm recommending that defendants pursue civil rights claims for wrongful conviction. Morrison's hands were steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. This will be public, it will be controversial, and it will almost certainly end my career because I'm admitting I failed to adequately scrutinize testimony from an officer who should never have been trusted. You were lied to systematically, Lena said. That's not the same as being complicit. Isn't it? I'm a judge. My job is to ensure justice happens in my courtroom. If I'm rubber stamping police testimony without adequate verification, if I'm allowing convictions based on one officer's word against defendants who lack resources to mount effective defense, That's not justice. That's just processing human beings through system designed to confirm predetermined outcomes. The honesty was brutal, self-awareness that came too late for the 12 people Morrison had convicted, but early enough to prevent future harm. Lena recognized the expression from her own mirror, someone confronting their failures and deciding to do better, even when better came with catastrophic personal costs. "I need you to review the case files," Morrison continued. "Look at Vance's testimony patterns. Identify commonalities that might help other judges recognize similar conduct in their jurisdictions. This isn't just Mitchell County problem. Officers like Vance exist everywhere, and if we can document how they operate, we can train judges to spot and stop them." Lena accepted the files, 50 pounds of paper representing lives destroyed by lies that had worn badge and carried weight of institutional authority. "I'll review them. But Judge Morrison, you should know what you're doing, vacating those convictions publicly, admitting judicial error, that takes more courage than most people have. Your career might survive if you're willing to be face of reform rather than just another casualty." "I'm 63 years old. My career is less important than those 12 people getting their lives back." Morrison's expression softened fractionally. "But I appreciate the thought. Now, there's one more thing you need to know before you leave." She pulled up a different file, this one marked with federal seals and classification warnings that made it clear they were entering territory beyond standard judicial review. DOJ shared this under seal because it affects ongoing investigation. Derek Vance has been cooperating with federal prosecutors, providing testimony about other officers in exchange for reduced sentencing recommendations. Lena felt ice settle in her stomach. He's naming accomplices. 23 officers across 4 counties in Nevada and 2 in California. Some participated actively in his schemes, others just looked the other way, but all of them enabled pattern of abuse that spans 2 decades and affects hundreds of victims. Morrison's voice was grim. "This is bigger than anyone realized. What happened to you? What happened to those 25 victims? That's just the visible surface of corruption that goes deep into multiple law enforcement agencies. How many victims total?" "Current estimate is between 200 and 300, but that's conservative. Many victims won't come forward out of fear, shame, or just wanting to move on. Some are likely dead or incarcerated on false charges we haven't identified yet." Morrison closed the file. "DOJ is building RICO case, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. They're treating these law enforcement agencies like organized crime syndicates because functionally, that's what they became. The scope was overwhelming. Individual tragedy multiplied into systemic catastrophe. One phone call revealing infrastructure of abuse that had operated openly for years because nobody with power had cared enough to stop it." Lena sat processing implications while Morrison watched with the expression of someone who'd delivered terrible news many times but never got used to the weight. "Why are you telling me this?" Lena asked finally. "Because DOJ wants you to testify. Not just about your case, but as expert witness on how these systems operate, how they target victims, how they maintain silence through intimidation and institutional capture." Morrison leaned forward, intensity replacing her earlier measured tone. "You're uniquely positioned, decorated veteran, so they can't dismiss you as civilian who doesn't understand law enforcement, trauma nurse, so you have medical credibility, victim who fought back successfully, so you understand both sides. Prosecutors think your testimony could be cornerstone of entire RICO case. And if I say no, then they build the case without you, and it's probably weaker, and some defendants probably walk, and some agencies probably escape federal oversight." Morrison's honesty was relentless, but saying yes means months of depositions, testimony, media scrutiny. It means becoming public face of prosecution against dozens of cops who will fight back with everything they have. It means death threats, harassment, your life under microscope while defense attorneys try to destroy your credibility. So basically, what's already happening, just amplified. Essentially, yes. Lena stood, walked to Morrison's window overlooking the courthouse square where monuments to justice stood beside reminders that justice was aspiration rather than guarantee. Somewhere in federal holding, Derek Vance was negotiating his cooperation, trading accomplices for reduced sentences. The same transactional morality that had defined his career now applied to his prosecution. "I'll do it," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." Every victim who testifies gets protection, not just legal, but financial, psychological, physical security. These people are already traumatized. I won't let them be re-traumatized by a legal process that treats them like evidence instead of human beings. Morrison smiled, the expression transforming her stern judicial face into something more human. DOJ has already agreed to comprehensive victim services. You're not the first person to demand it, but you might be the most insistent. They're taking this seriously. They better be. Because if this turns into show trial that grinds up victims for political points without actually delivering justice, I will make it my personal mission to ensure everyone knows exactly how badly the system failed. Noted and recorded. Morrison extended her hand again, shake firmer this time. Welcome to the hardest thing you'll probably ever do, Staff Sergeant, but also potentially the most important. Lena left the courthouse through the back exit to avoid reporters who'd learned her schedule and staked out obvious locations. Her car was where she'd left it, undisturbed except for note tucked under the windshield wiper. Handwritten, unsigned, message brief and threatening. Should have kept your mouth shut. Marines die too. She photographed the note with her phone, texted the image to Agent Chen with caption, "Threat received. Courthouse parking lot, north section. Requesting security assessment and evidence collection." Chen's response was immediate. "Stay in public place. Agents en route. Do not touch the note further or drive the car until it's been cleared." 10 minutes later, federal agents descended on the courthouse parking lot with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, photographing the note from multiple angles, dusting her car for prints, checking for explosives, or tracking devices with equipment that looked like it belonged in spy movies rather than Nevada parking lots. Agent Reeves approached while her team worked, expression professionally neutral, but eyes showing concern that probably violated some federal regulation about emotional investment in cases. Notes being analyzed for prints and DNA. Cars clean, no devices, no tampering. You're safe to drive, but we're recommending security detail. I don't want security following me around. I understand, but this threat is credible. Vance naming 23 accomplices means 23 people with everything to lose if RICO prosecution succeeds. Some of them will fight legally, some politically, and some, she gestured at the note, will consider extrajudicial options. So what? I get federal babysitters for the next year? More like federal neighbors who happen to be armed and trained in executive protection. Reeves softened slightly. Look, I get it. You're trained, you're capable, you've survived worse than some dirty cops with grudges, but you're also exhausted, working 12-hour trauma shifts, dealing with press attention, and now testifying in case that will make you target for organized criminal network masquerading as law enforcement. Let us help. Alina wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle her own security, but pragmatism overrode pride. She was one person, however well trained, against dozens of people who'd already demonstrated willingness to break every rule, including the ones about threatening federal witnesses. Fine, but they stay outside my apartment, don't interfere with my work, and don't follow me into the hospital or gym or grocery store unless there's active threat. Deal. Reeves made notes. We'll have rotating two-person teams, unmarked vehicles, minimal intrusion. You probably won't even notice them most of the time. I'll notice. Yeah, you probably will, but you'll also be alive to notice, which is the important part. The security detail started that evening. Unmarked sedan parking across from Lena's apartment building, two agents who introduced themselves as Roberts and Chen, no relation to the lead investigator, and then proceeded to become furniture, present but unobtrusive, there but not there. Lena tried to maintain normal routine, going for evening run while Roberts followed at discreet distance, cooking dinner while Chen verified building security, sleeping while they monitored access points and threat assessments. It should have felt suffocating, should have triggered her instinct for privacy and autonomy, but instead it felt oddly comforting, like having fire team watching her six during patrol through hostile territory. The next morning brought news that Derek Vance's cooperation had triggered arrest warrants for 12 officers across 3 states, dawn raids coordinated by FBI, to prevent evidence destruction or flight. The operation was public, deliberately so. Federal authorities sending message that law enforcement corruption would be prosecuted with the same aggressive tactics used against organized crime. 6 officers surrendered peacefully. 4 resisted, requiring tactical teams to extract them from homes where they'd fortified positions and prepared for confrontation. 2 fled, triggering manhunts that would dominate regional news for days until they were caught trying to cross into Mexico with falsified documents and enough cash to suggest they'd been planning this contingency for years. Sheriff Hardwick called Lena directly, his voice showing strain of someone watching his professional world collapse in real time. 3 of the arrested officers worked for me. I hired them, I supervised them, I trusted them. How did I miss this? Because they were good at hiding it, Lena said, not offering false comfort. Because the system was designed to hide it. Because asking questions was harder than accepting surface appearances. That's not good enough. No, it's not. But it's true, and truth is what we're working with now. She paused, considering whether next words would help or harm. Sheriff, you're doing the right thing, staying, reforming, admitting failures publicly. That's harder than hiding, and it matters more than you probably realize. Tell that to the 3 officers I hired who are now in federal custody. I'd rather tell it to the victims who are getting justice because you chose accountability over covering your ass. Hardwick was quiet for a moment. Fair point. Thank you for that. The preliminary hearings began 2 weeks later, federal courthouse in Reno, transforming into theater where corruption was documented with the methodical precision that characterized DOJ prosecutions. Lena attended when her schedule allowed, watching as prosecutors built their case brick by brick, testimony by testimony, document by damning document. She watched Derek Vance take the stand in shackles, his earlier swagger completely absent, replaced by defeated cooperation of someone who'd calculated that betraying accomplices was better than dying in prison. He named names, provided details, corroborated evidence that prosecution had gathered independently, his testimony transforming from law enforcement officer to criminal informant with the ease of someone who'd always understood authority was just performance. Defense attorneys tried to shred him, attacking his credibility with the irony that he'd built career on being believable and was now being destroyed for admitting he'd lied about everything. But the documentary evidence supported his cooperation testimony. Financial records, encrypted communications, body camera footage that officers thought had been deleted, but federal forensics had recovered. The case was airtight, overwhelming, the kind of prosecution that made defense attorneys recommend plea deals because trial would just mean longer sentences. Over 3 weeks, 16 of the 23 arrested officers accepted agreements, cooperating further, naming additional accomplices. The corruption unraveling like thread pulled from rotten fabric. The 7 who refused to plead went to trial, their lawyers arguing entrapment, selective prosecution, anything that might create reasonable doubt. Lena testified in 4 of those trials, her composed recitation of facts and timeline destroying defense narratives that required her to be confused or malicious or anything other than competent veteran who documented everything with precision that made cross-examination futile. Defense attorneys tried anyway, attacking her military service, her decision to call DOD rather than local lawyers, her refusal to accept plea deal she'd never been legitimately offered. But every attack just reinforced prosecution's narrative that she'd been victimized by officers who assumed she'd be too intimidated or too isolated to fight back, and that their miscalculation had triggered their own destruction. Guilty verdicts came quickly, juries deliberating hours rather than days, decisions unanimous, sentences harsh enough to send message that law enforcement corruption would be punished with the same severity as any other organized crime. Derek Vance received 18 years despite cooperation, his charges too numerous and too severe for mercy. His accomplices received between 8 and 22 years depending on their participation levels, their careers ended, their pensions forfeit, their families left to navigate consequences of choices that had seemed safe until someone finally said no. Judge Morrison's decision to vacate 12 convictions became model for other jurisdictions. 37 additional cases overturned in Nevada alone, hundreds more under review in California, Arizona, Utah. The ripple effects expanded beyond anyone's initial calculations. Systemic reform forced by one woman's refusal to accept injustice and one phone call that had triggered avalanche. 6 months after that night at the gas station, Lena stood in the same courthouse where she'd given the press conference, this time for much quieter ceremony. The victims, Now officially exonerated, their records expunged, their convictions erased, gathered to receive formal apologies from county officials and compensation payments from settlement fund that taxpayers would fund because the alternative was dozens of individual lawsuits. Jessica Moreno approached Lena afterward, the young woman whose mother had broken through security at the press conference, whose drug conviction had destroyed career prospects for 4 years until federal investigation finally delivered justice. "I got into nursing school," Jessica said, her smile transforming a face that had carried too much stress for too long. "They accepted my application once the conviction was expunged. I start in January." "That's incredible. Congratulations." "I wanted to be you," Jessica continued. "When I heard your story, saw you in that uniform, learned you'd fought back and won, I realized I didn't have to be defined by what Derek Vance did to me. I could build something better." Lena felt throat tighten, unexpected emotion breaking through professional composure she'd maintained for months. "You were always more than what he did to you. The expungement just gave you permission to show it." Other victims shared similar stories: jobs obtained, education resumed, lives restarted without the anchor of false convictions dragging them down. Not all stories were positive. Some victims remained too traumatized to benefit from exoneration. Some had lost too much time to recover. Some were dead, and their posthumous exoneration was cold comfort to families left behind. But enough lives were salvaged, enough futures restored, that the cost of fighting seemed justified by outcomes that mattered. Agent Chen found Lena as the ceremony concluded, his expression mixing satisfaction and fatigue of someone who'd spent 6 months building cases that had fundamentally reshaped law enforcement in Nevada and beyond. "Final statistics," he said, consulting tablet that had become extension of his hand. "RICO case resulted in 73 convictions across 6 states. 212 victims compensated, 347 cases overturned or under review. 15 law enforcement agencies under federal consent decrees requiring comprehensive reform, and 1 phone call that started it all." "Don't romanticize it," Lena said. "I made a call because I had resources most people don't have. The real heroes are the victims who came forward knowing it would be hard. The deputies like Santos who chose truth over loyalty, the judges like Morrison who admitted failures publicly." "True. But you were the catalyst. You're the one who proved that fighting back was possible." Chen closed his tablet. "For what it's worth, DOD is recommending you for civilian commendation, and the Marine Corps is discussing whether your actions warrant official recognition beyond just veteran services calling to check on you." "I don't need awards. I just needed to go home from work without being arrested for crimes I didn't commit. And now 212 other people get to do the same thing because you refused to accept that injustice was inevitable." Chen extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant, both in uniform and out." After he left, Lena stood in the courthouse lobby watching victims reunite with families, celebrate victories that had cost more than victory should require, begin rebuilding lives that corrupt officers had nearly destroyed. She thought about Eduardo, the gunshot victim she'd kept alive during that ambulance ride, who'd survived and recovered and returned to family that loved him. She thought about the countless patients she'd saved in emergency rooms across years of nursing, the lives preserved through competence and training and refusal to give up when outcomes looked hopeless. And she thought about Derek Vance sitting in federal prison where he'd spend the next 18 years contemplating how one night's miscalculation had destroyed everything he'd built on foundation of lies and intimidation. Her phone buzzed. Message from hospital director. "Major trauma incoming, mass casualty event. All available personnel report immediately." Lena was moving before conscious thought engaged, training overriding everything else, because this was who she was beneath the uniform, and the testimony, and the public recognition. She was a nurse who saved lives, veteran who protected people, someone who showed up when crisis demanded and did the work that mattered regardless of personal cost. The reporters waiting outside the courthouse tried to intercept her. Questions shouted about final verdicts and her reaction and what came next. She ignored them all, climbing into her car where federal security detail was already coordinating with hospital security to ensure safe passage. "Major trauma," she told Roberts, who was driving today. "Silver Ridge Medical, multiple victims." "We're on it." Roberts activated lights and sirens that unmarked vehicle technically shouldn't have, federal authority overriding normal protocols when emergency demanded. ETA 7 minutes. Lena used the time to change mentally from victim advocate to trauma nurse, compartmentalizing the morning ceremony and returning to headspace where medical decisions happen in seconds, and hesitation meant death. By the time they reached the hospital, she was already assessing likely injuries based on dispatch information. Factory explosion. Multiple burns, possible crush injuries, the kind of catastrophic event that turned emergency rooms into battlefields where triage determined who lived and who didn't. She emerged from the car already moving, federal security dropping back as hospital security took over, her scrubs replacing the civilian clothes she'd worn to the ceremony, her identity shifting again from public figure to medical professional whose job was saving lives while others worried about everything else. The trauma bay was organized chaos when she arrived, Dr. Martinez already directing teams, patients arriving in waves that threatened to overwhelm capacity. Lena found her assignment, 35-year-old male, second-degree burns across 40% of body surface, airway potentially compromised by smoke inhalation, vitals unstable and threatening to crash. She stabilized him through training and instinct, establishing airways and lines and medications that bought time for surgeons to arrive and take over definitive care. Then the next patient, and the next, hours blurring into continuous action where thinking happened too fast for conscious awareness, where mistakes meant death and success meant someone got to see tomorrow. 6 hours later, when the last victim had been stabilized or transferred or sent to morgue for victims who'd arrived already beyond saving, Lena stood in the locker room letting exhaustion finally register. Her scrubs were ruined again, blood and burn residue, and the physical evidence of emergency medicine practiced at its most intense. Dr. Martinez found her there, matching exhaustion on a face that had spent 6 hours making life or death decisions. 14 patients, 11 saved, 3 lost before we could help. Given the severity of their injuries and the chaos of the scene, that's about as good as we could hope for. The 3 we lost were probably dead before the ambulances arrived. Sometimes the explosion wins regardless of what we do afterward. Martinez sat heavily, professional distance cracking to show grief underneath. But 11 people are alive because you and everyone else in that trauma bay refused to give up. That matters, Lena. That always matters. Lena nodded, processing mathematics where success and failure coexisted in same outcome. Where saving 11 meant losing 3. Where doing everything right still meant watching people die. It was the fundamental equation of emergency medicine, the calculation that had driven her from Marines to nursing, the attempt to answer chaos with competence and hope that competence would be enough. Her phone showed messages from victims' advocates, from federal prosecutors, from Marine Corps representatives, all congratulating her on morning ceremony and asking about next steps in cases that would continue for years. But underneath those official communications was a single text from unknown number. You think you won. You didn't. This isn't over. She forwarded it to Agent Reeves without comment. The threat routine enough now that it didn't spike her pulse, just another piece of evidence in cases that kept expanding as more corruption was uncovered. The response came quickly. Traced a burner phone purchased in Carson City. Agents investigating. Security detail notified. You're covered. Lena deleted the threat, changed into clean scrubs, and returned to the emergency room where normal traumas continued arriving. Heart attacks, and car accidents, and falls, and all the mundane ways humans broke down or broke apart. She treated them with the same competence she'd shown during the mass casualty event, the same focus she'd maintained through federal testimony, the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her military service. Because this was who she was, beneath everything else. Someone who showed up when needed and did the work that mattered, regardless of threats or publicity or consequences that rippled outward from one phone call made 6 months ago in a sheriff's station at 3 in the morning. And if Derek Vance's remaining accomplices wanted to threaten her, they'd discover what he'd learned too late. That some people didn't intimidate easily, that some training didn't fade, and that making an enemy of someone who'd survived worse than they could imagine was perhaps the final miscalculation in careers built on assuming victims would stay silent. Her shift ended at midnight, the hospital finally quieting after the factory explosion's aftermath had been processed through emergency medicine's brutal efficiency. Lena walked to her car through parking lot illuminated by sodium lights that turned everything orange and surreal, her security detail visible in the unmarked sedan 50 feet away, Roberts raising a hand in acknowledgement that she was leaving. The drive home took her past the Crossroads Gas and Go, the station where everything had started 6 months ago. She hadn't stopped there since that night, but she slowed enough to see that new management had taken over, the flickering lights replaced, the station cleaner, the whole place transformed by time and distance from crime scene to just another highway rest stop. Her apartment building appeared unchanged, though she knew federal agents had hardened security in ways invisible to casual observation. Upgraded locks, camera systems, access protocols that meant unexpected visitors got intercepted before reaching her floor. She'd protested the expense initially, argued she didn't need fortress-level protection, but Reeves had been insistent and ultimately correct. 3 more threats had arrived over the past month, each traced to associates of convicted officers, each resulting in additional arrests that expanded the conspiracy case into territories nobody had initially anticipated. Inside her apartment, Lena found an envelope that had been slipped under her door despite building security, federal monitoring, all the infrastructure designed to prevent exactly this kind of breach. She photographed it before touching, texted the image to her security detail, received immediate response. "Don't open. Agents en route." But the handwriting on the envelope was familiar, feminine, and the return address was Silver Ridge Medical Center's administrative office. Lena opened it carefully, finding a single sheet of hospital letterhead with message from Director Chen. Different Chen than the federal agent, though she'd started mentally cataloging all the Chens in her life like they were distinct species. Staff Sergeant Brooks, the board of directors, has voted unanimously to establish the Lena Brooks Patient Advocacy Fund, dedicated to providing legal support for medical professionals who face retaliation or prosecution for performing their duties. The fund will be seeded with $500,000 from hospital reserves and matching donations from our trauma department physicians. Additionally, we're implementing mandatory training on rights during law enforcement interactions using protocols you developed. Every nurse, every technician, every staff member will know what you knew, that competence and documentation are weapons against those who abuse authority. You didn't ask to be a symbol, but you've become one anyway. Thank you for showing us what principled resistance looks like. Director Patricia Chen, Silver Ridge Medical Center. Lena read it twice, emotions cycling through surprise, discomfort at being memorialized while still alive, and reluctant recognition that refusing acknowledgement would insult the intention behind it. Her phone rang before she could process further. Agent Reeves, voice tight with urgency that immediately shifted Lena's awareness into combat mode. "We've got a situation. 4 former deputies from Mitchell County, all connected to the Vance network, all released on bail pending trial. They disappeared 6 hours ago, GPS monitors disabled, last known location converging on Nevada-California border. We think they're running, but their trajectory puts them within 20 miles of your location." "You think they're running toward me?" "We think they're desperate enough to try something stupid before fleeing. Federal marshals are en route, local PD is on alert, but I need you to relocate immediately to secure facility until we have them in custody." "No." The refusal was automatic, visceral rejection of being driven from her home by men who'd already taken too much. "I'm not running from cops who should have been stopped years ago." "Lena, this isn't about bravery or making a point. These are trained law enforcement officers with access to weapons, tactical knowledge, and nothing left to lose. They know your address, your schedule, your security arrangements. They're coming with specific purpose, and that purpose is almost certainly violent. Then let them come. I'm trained too. I know this terrain, and I'm not abandoning my life because 4 criminals want revenge." Lena moved through her apartment with practiced efficiency, checking windows, securing doors, retrieving the Glock 19 she'd purchased after the first threat and had been training with at the range weekly. "How far out are your marshals?" 20 minutes, maybe 15 if they push traffic laws." "Then I need to hold position for 15 minutes. I've held worse positions with worse odds." She chambered a round muscle memory from thousands of training repetitions, making the action automatic. "Where's my security detail?" Roberts and Chen are outside, armed and coordinating with incoming tactical team. "But Lena, please, professional to professional, don't make this your last stand over symbolic point about not being intimidated. It's not symbolic, it's definitional." Lena killed the apartment lights, positioning herself where she had clear sightlines to the door and windows while remaining invisible from outside. I spent 12 years in the Marines fighting people who wanted to impose their will through violence. I'm not letting some corrupt cops succeed where Taliban failed. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Okay, but you stay on this line, you narrate everything you see, and if I tell you to retreat, you retreat. Deal? Deal. The next 10 minutes stretched like hours, every sound amplified by adrenaline and darkness, every car passing on the street below potentially containing threats. Roberts checked in via text. 2 vehicles approaching, no plates visible. Occupants matched description of fugitives. Intercepting. Then sounds of confrontation, shouted commands, running feet, the distinctive crack of gunfire that Lena's training identified immediately as 9mm, multiple shooters, rate of fire suggesting panic rather than controlled engagement. She moved to her window, staying low, observing the parking lot where Roberts and Chen had taken cover behind their sedan, returning fire against 2 vehicles that had pulled in aggressively. 4 men emerging with weapons drawn in clear intention to overwhelm security through superior numbers. Federal agents in active engagement, Lena reported to Reeves, her voice steady despite pulse hammering in her ears. 4 suspects armed with handguns attempting to breach building entrance. My security detail is outnumbered but holding position. Tactical Team ETA, 7 minutes. Tell Roberts to fall back, don't try to hold against those odds. Lena texted Roberts, received response almost immediately. Can't retreat? They'll reach your apartment. Holding here. The tactical calculus was clear. Roberts and Chen were sacrificing tactical advantage to buy time for reinforcements, accepting exposure and inferior position because the alternative was letting armed fugitives reach civilian residential building where collateral damage could be catastrophic. Lena made a decision that training supported, even though regulations would probably condemn it. She opened her window, acquiring sight picture on the nearest fugitive who was advancing on Roberts's position with weapon raised, clear intention to execute a federal agent who was already wounded based on the way he was moving. The shot was clean, 60 feet, stationary target focused on different threat, center mass impact that dropped him immediately. Her Marine Corps marksmanship training had emphasized that the first rule of firefights was disrupting enemy action, and nothing disrupted action like suddenly being under fire from unexpected direction. The 3 remaining fugitives scattered, seeking cover, their coordinated assault fragmenting into survival instinct as they processed that they were now caught between federal agents and unknown shooter with clear elevation advantage. Lena, what the hell was that? Reeves's voice carried equal parts horror and admiration. That was covering fire for agents under assault. 1 suspect down, 3 seeking cover, tactical advantage shifted to defenders. Lena acquired sight picture on second target, but he'd gone to ground behind engine block that would defeat her 9mm rounds. Tell your tactical team they've got approximately 4 minutes before these guys either flee or regroup for another assault. Sirens approached from multiple directions. Federal marshals, local police, the overwhelming response that came when law enforcement officers engaged in active firefight in residential area. The 3 remaining fugitives recognized the tactical reality, abandoned their assault, retreated to their vehicles attempting to flee before the net closed. They made it perhaps 2 blocks before roadblocks materialized, the kind of coordinated interdiction that came from agencies that had been preparing for exactly this contingency. Within minutes, all 3 were in custody, face down on asphalt, weapons secured, their desperate gambit ending in capture rather than the revenge they'd sought. Lena cleared her weapon, secured it, and opened her door to find Roberts climbing the stairs, bleeding from shoulder wound that looked painful but not immediately life-threatening. She'd transitioned from shooter to nurse before conscious thought engaged, assessing damage with hands that had compressed worse wounds under worse circumstances. Through and through, missed the major vessels. You'll need antibiotics and probably some physical therapy, but you're not dying tonight. She applied pressure with dish towel from her kitchen, the absurdity of improvised trauma care in her own apartment not lost on her. Chen? Leg wound, superficial, already being treated by paramedics. Roberts winced as pressure sent pain signals his brain couldn't ignore. You just shot a fleeing felon from your apartment window using a personal weapon during active federal operation. Reeves is going to have paperwork nightmares. I shot an armed assailant who was attempting to execute a federal agent. That's called defense of others. and it's legal in every jurisdiction, including this one. Lena maintained pressure while guiding Roberts to sit against her wall. Also, you're welcome. Thank you. Roberts managed a pained smile. Though between you and me, that was a hell of a shot for someone who's supposed to be a trauma nurse. Marine Corps marksmanship training is thorough. Turns out it doesn't expire just because you change careers. Federal marshals flooded her building within minutes, securing the scene, documenting everything, treating her apartment like crime scene because technically it was justified shooting, legally defensible, but still homicide that would require investigation and review. The fugitive she'd shot was alive, wounded but stable, already being transported to the same hospital where she worked, which would create interesting professional dynamics if she ended up treating him during her next shift. Agent Reeves arrived looking simultaneously relieved and furious, her professional composure barely containing emotions that probably violated federal regulations about remaining objective during operations. You shot someone from your apartment window during a federal tactical operation. Oh, I provided covering fire for agents under assault, preventing what would likely have been their execution, and neutralized one of 4 armed assailants attempting to breach my residence with clear intent to cause harm. Lena's recitation was formal, military after-action report rather than defensive justification. All actions were consistent with Nevada self-defense statutes and federal guidelines regarding protection of law enforcement personnel. You're not wrong, but you're also going to be interviewed by about 15 different agencies, all of whom will want to document exactly how a trauma nurse happened to make a 60-foot precision shot under stress in low-light conditions. 12 years Marine Corps, intelligence specialist with extensive combat deployment experience, regular range training maintained post-discharge. The shooting was consistent with my training and experience. Lena met Reeves's eyes steadily. Was I supposed to watch your agents get executed when I had capability to intervene? Reeves's expression softened. No, you were supposed to do exactly what you did, and everyone who matters will recognize that once the initial panic subsides. But Lena, you just killed someone. That's not nothing, even when it's justified. I wounded someone who was attempting murder. Whether he dies is up to trauma surgeons at Silver Ridge Medical. Lena felt detachment settling in, the psychological distance that had let her function in Afghanistan when violence was daily occurrence rather than exceptional event. And I've killed people before, Agent Reeves, in uniform, in combat zones, following rules of engagement that were substantially more restrictive than tonight's situation. This isn't my first time making that choice. The next 6 hours blurred into interviews and statements and documentation, federal agents and local detectives and internal affairs investigators, all needing her account of events that had lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but would generate months of review. She narrated everything with the precision that had characterized her military debriefings, acknowledging actions without apologizing for decisions that had saved lives regardless of their complexity. Dawn was breaking when the last investigator finally left, her apartment still technically crime scene, but released back to her custody with understanding that she needed sleep more than continued interrogation. Roberts had been transported to hospital, Chen likewise, both with wounds that would heal and commendations that would probably complicate their careers by making them heroes when they'd just been doing their jobs. Lena stood at her window watching sunrise paint the Nevada sky in colors that didn't care about human violence or justice or the complicated mathematics of when killing was justified. Her phone showed messages from hospital administration placing her on administrative leave pending shooting review, from Marine Corps liaison offering support and counseling, from victims advocacy groups expressing solidarity and offering resources she didn't need but appreciated anyway. And one message from Sheriff Hardwick, sent at 5:47 a.m. Federal marshals briefed me on the incident. You saved 2 agents' lives while protecting yourself from men who should never have been released on bail. I'm sorry this happened. I'm sorry my department's corruption put you in position where you had to make that choice. And I'm grateful you're alive to receive this apology. She didn't respond immediately, too exhausted to formulate words that would carry appropriate weight. Instead, she showered, washing away gunpowder residue and the smell of violence, letting hot water dissolve tension that had sustained her through the night but was no longer necessary. Sleep came hard and shallow, interrupted by dreams where faces shifted between Derek Vance and Taliban fighters and the fugitive she'd shot, all of them wearing expressions of surprise that someone had fought back, that authority and intimidation weren't sufficient to guarantee victory. She woke to afternoon sun and phone ringing with call from Agent Chen, the federal one, not the hospital director or her security detail. His voice carried exhaustion matching her own. All 4 fugitives in custody, all facing attempted murder charges in addition to their corruption cases. The one you shot is stable, will survive to face trial, though his lawyer is already suggesting you used excessive force. Let him suggest. My lawyer will respond with video evidence of 4 armed men assaulting federal agents with clear intent to commit murder, and with ballistics showing I fired exactly 1 shot that prevented exactly 1 execution. Lena's voice was flat, professional detachment maintained through force of will. How's Roberts? Surgery went well, full recovery expected, already talking about returning to duty, despite medical staff insisting he needs minimum 6 weeks leave. Chen paused. He wanted me to tell you that he owes you his life, and that he's never seen anyone transition from civilian to combat mindset that fast. Tell him Marines don't really have civilian mindset. We just pretend when circumstances require it. I'll pass that along. Another pause, this one carrying different weight. The Shooting Review Board convened this morning. Preliminary finding is justified use of force in defense of others. There'll be formal hearing, but it's procedural rather than investigative. You're clear, Lena. Legally, professionally, morally, you did everything right. Doesn't make it feel right. No, it doesn't. But that's what separates people like you from people like Vance. You feel the weight of violence even when it's necessary. He never did. After the call ended, Lena dressed and drove to Silver Ridge Medical Center, not for her shift, but to check on the man she'd shot, professional obligation overriding personal discomfort. The hospital staff looked at her differently now. Not just respected trauma nurse, but someone who'd killed to protect federal agents. The complexity of that action visible in expressions that mixed admiration with unease. Dr. Martinez intercepted her before she reached the recovery wing. He's stable, conscious, and already demanding to speak with you. His lawyer says no. His federal handlers say absolutely not, but he's insistent. You want me to facilitate or refuse on medical grounds? Facilitate? I want to hear what he has to say. The patient, identified in medical records as Thomas Brennan, former deputy, current federal defendant facing 20 years minimum, was handcuffed to his hospital bed despite the chest wound that made movement painful. He looked younger than Lena expected, maybe 35, with the kind of face that suggested he'd been earnest recruit once before corruption had transformed him into fugitive attempting murder. Staff Sergeant Brooks, his voice was rough from intubation, but coherent. I wanted to thank you for not killing me. I wasn't trying to kill you. I was trying to stop you from killing Agent Roberts. Lena remained near the door, maintaining distance that was both professional and tactical. Did it work? Yeah. He laughed bitterly, the sound catching on damaged tissue. You stopped me, stopped all of us, and now we're going to spend the next 2 decades in federal prison because we were stupid enough to think revenge was worth throwing away our last chance at plea deals. Why did you do it? You had bail, you had lawyers, you had option to fight legally. Why throw all of that away for assault that was never going to succeed? Brennan met her eyes, his expression carrying something between regret and defiance. Because Vance told us you were the reason everything collapsed. That if you'd just accepted the arrest, taken the plea deal, none of this would have happened. 200 convictions, 73 people going to prison, hundreds of careers destroyed, all because you made one phone call. All because you committed crimes and abused authority and victimized people who couldn't fight back. Lena kept her voice level, despite anger building underneath. I didn't create your corruption. I just had resources to stop it when it targeted me. I know that now. Took getting shot and facing life in prison to see it clearly, but I know. He closed his eyes briefly. I joined law enforcement because I wanted to help people. Somewhere along the way, helping people became controlling people, and controlling became exploiting, and I stopped noticing the difference. Vance made it easy, showed us how the system worked, how to manipulate it, how to profit while pretending to serve. That's an explanation, not an excuse. I'm not making excuses. I'm confessing. his eyes open, meeting hers directly. I participated in 14 false arrests over 6 years. I testified falsely in 9 trials. I accepted bribes from 4 suspects in exchange for favorable reports. I enabled Derek Vance's worst behavior because it was easier than reporting him, and easier than admitting I'd become exactly what I'd joined to fight against. Why tell me this? Because you're the only person in this entire disaster who actually fought for justice instead of revenge or self-preservation or political advantage. Brennan's voice dropped to near whisper. And because if I'm going to spend the next 20 years in prison, I want at least one person to know I understand why I'm there and that I deserve it. Lena stood silent for a long moment, processing confession that was too honest to dismiss and too late to matter for his legal situation. The victims you helped convict, they're being contacted for possible civil suits. You should cooperate fully, provide details that help their cases, because that's the only restitution available to you now. I will. My lawyer says cooperating is suicide for my defense, but my defense is already dead. Might as well make my cooperation mean something. She left him there, handcuffed and wounded and facing consequences that would consume the rest of his functional life, and felt no satisfaction in his ruin. Just exhausted recognition that systems of corruption required willing participants, that authority attracted both servants and predators, and that distinguishing between them was harder than it should be. The formal shooting review hearing occurred 3 weeks later. Standard procedure compressed into accelerated timeline because federal interest and media attention made prolonged uncertainty untenable. Lena testified for 90 minutes, narrating events with precision that made cross-examination futile. Her actions so clearly justified that even the review board's most skeptical members couldn't find legitimate criticism. The ruling was unanimous. Justified use of deadly force in defense of others, no policy violations, no recommended discipline, case closed with commendation for decisive action under extreme circumstances. It should have felt like victory, but instead felt like administrative processing of violence that was necessary but not celebratory. Derek Vance's final sentencing happened the same week, federal judge imposing 18 years followed by lifetime supervised release, the maximum allowed under his plea agreement. He stood in orange jumpsuit showing none of his earlier swagger, aging visible in the months since his arrest, career and freedom and identity all destroyed by systems he'd manipulated for years before they finally turned against him. Lena attended the sentencing, sitting in the gallery beside 23 other victims who'd come to watch justice delivered in increments of years and restrictions and permanent criminal record. Vance never looked at them, his gaze fixed on some middle distance where maybe he could pretend this was happening to someone else. The judge's statement was brutal in its precision. You were entrusted with authority to protect citizens and uphold law. Instead, you exploited that authority for personal gain, victimized the vulnerable, and corrupted an institution that communities depend on for security and justice. Your actions weren't mistakes or lapses in judgment. They were systematic, calculated, and sustained over a decade. This sentence reflects not just the crimes you committed, but the profound betrayal of trust that accompanied them. Vance was led away without comment, disappearing into federal custody where he'd remain until he was 56 years old, his career erased, his pension forfeited, his reputation permanently destroyed by choices that had seemed safe until someone finally refused to be his victim. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered for final statements, this narrative arc reaching conclusion that would dominate one news cycle before being replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrages. Lena gave them 2 minutes, standing in sunlight that felt warmer than the day's temperature suggested. Derek Vance's sentencing represents accountability, but not closure. The victims he hurt still carry trauma. The systems he corrupted still require reform. The communities he betrayed still need healing. She paused, gathering thoughts that had crystallized over months of testimony and violence and exhausted certainty. But today proves that authority can be challenged, that corruption can be exposed, and that people who fight back can win. Not easily, not quickly, but definitively. "What's next for you?" a reporter asked. "I'm returning to work at Silver Ridge Medical Center. I'm continuing to consult on law enforcement reform initiatives. And I'm establishing a nonprofit foundation to provide legal support for people facing retaliation from corrupt officials." The foundation had been Jessica Moreno's idea, the nursing student who'd been inspired by Lena's example, and it felt right in ways that personal vindication couldn't match. Justice shouldn't require DoD clearances or federal connections. It should be accessible to everyone, and I'm going to spend whatever energy I have left making that reality rather than aspiration. The foundation launched 6 months later, seeded with her compensation from the county settlement and donations from victims who'd received their own settlements and wanted to help others fight battles they'd barely survived themselves. It provided lawyers for nurses facing retaliation, veterans navigating hostile bureaucracies. Anyone caught in the machinery of authority that had forgotten its purpose was service rather than control. Lena ran it from her apartment evenings and weekends, coordinating with advocacy groups and legal clinics, matching victims with resources, building infrastructure that would survive beyond her personal involvement. The work was endless, funding perpetually insufficient, outcomes mixed between triumphant vindication and crushing defeat. But it mattered in ways that felt true. Building something constructive from trauma that could have destroyed her, but instead had become foundation for helping others survive similar battles. A year after that night at the gas station, Lena stood in the same Silver Ridge Medical Center trauma bay where she'd stabilized Eduardo, watching a new class of nursing students rotate through emergency medicine orientation. They listened with the intense focus of people who understood that these skills would mean the difference between life and death, that competence wasn't optional when patients arrived bleeding and terrified. Doctor. Martinez introduced her with warmth that had deepened from professional respect into genuine friendship. This is Lena Brooks, one of our senior trauma nurses. She's going to talk to you about protocols, documentation, and knowing your rights when authority figures try to interfere with your medical duties. Lena spent an hour sharing knowledge that had been bought through handcuffs and federal investigations and violence that still occasionally interrupted her sleep. She taught them how to document everything, how to recognize when law enforcement requests crossed into illegality, how to escalate when local systems failed. She taught them that competence was weapon and precision was armor, and that refusing to be intimidated was sometimes the most important skill they'd ever learn. Jessica Moreno was in that class, taking notes with intensity that suggested she'd never take anything for granted again. Her conviction expunged, but memory of injustice permanent. She approached Lena afterward, hesitant but determined. "I want to work with your foundation," Jessica said. "After I finish nursing school, after I get experience, I want to help other people the way you helped me. You're already helping by being here, by refusing to let false conviction define your future." Lena smiled, the expression coming easier now than it had months ago when every interaction had felt weighted by public scrutiny. "But yes, when you're ready, the foundation will be lucky to have you." That evening, Lena drove past the Crossroads Gas and Go one final time. The station fully renovated now, new ownership having erased the physical evidence of the night that had changed everything. She didn't stop, didn't need to stop, because the location mattered less than the choice she'd made there. The decision to resist when accepting seemed easier, to fight when surrender seemed inevitable. Her apartment waited with federal security still monitoring, but less obtrusively now that the threat level had decreased following the final convictions. Roberts had recovered fully and returned to duty, occasionally texting updates about cases and operations, and life continuing despite violence that had marked them both. Chen, her security detail Chen, had been reassigned to different protection details. Though they'd stayed in touch, their professional relationship transformed into something approaching friendship through shared experience of that night. Lena changed into civilian clothes, made coffee, and sat at her desk reviewing foundation applications from 3 people facing retaliation after reporting police misconduct. Each case required careful evaluation, resource allocation, strategic thinking about which battles could be won and which would consume energy better spent elsewhere. The work was identical to military intelligence analysis. The same pattern recognition and threat assessment and understanding of how systems functioned beyond their official descriptions. Her phone rang with call from Colonel Webb, the Marine Corps liaison who'd checked on her welfare throughout the investigation and prosecution. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd watched a subordinate excel under impossible circumstances. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, I'm calling with official notification that you're being awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Valor for your actions on the night of April 7th. The citation recognizes extraordinary heroism in defense of federal law enforcement personnel while under direct threat from armed assailants. Lena absorbed the information without immediate emotion, processing it like any other briefing. Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I was defending myself as much as the agents. It wasn't extraordinary. It was just training applied to crisis. That's exactly what makes it extraordinary, Webb said. Most people would have evacuated or hidden or hoped someone else would solve the problem. You assessed the tactical situation, identified the most effective intervention, and executed with precision that saved lives. That's not just training, that's character revealed under extreme pressure. The medal ceremony happened 2 months later at Marine Corps Base Quantico, formal military protocol that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar after years in civilian life. Lena wore her dress blues again, ribbons and medals arranged in precise rows, the uniform transforming her from trauma nurse into the warrior she'd been before civilian life had offered different battlefields. General Sarah Martinez, no relation to her hospital colleague, presented the medal with brief speech about service continuing beyond discharge, about warriors who brought their values into civilian life and made their communities safer through example and action. The assembled Marines stood at attention, the formal recognition of peer excellence that mattered more than any civilian award could match. Afterward, at the reception where protocol relaxed into conversation, General Martinez approached with expressions suggesting this wasn't purely social. Staff Sergeant Brooks, I've been following your foundation's work, the legal support for people facing retaliation, the training protocols for medical professionals, the advocacy for systemic reform. She paused, evaluating. Have you considered returning to active duty? The Marines could use someone with your unique combination of intelligence, experience, medical knowledge, and demonstrated courage under fire. With respect, ma'am, I've found my mission in civilian life. The Foundation helps people who don't have access to military infrastructure or federal resources. Returning to active duty would mean abandoning them to fight battles they can't win alone. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's the right answer, but if you ever change your mind or if you need Marine Corps resources to support your civilian mission, you have standing authorization to access veteran services and advocacy channels. We take care of our own, and your work is an extension of the values we claim to represent. Lena returned to Nevada the next day, medal secured in case that would probably sit in closet beside her dress blues, recognition that mattered less than the work it acknowledged. The Foundation had grown beyond her initial vision, now employing 3 part-time lawyers and coordinating with advocacy organizations across 6 states. The infrastructure expanding to meet demand that suggested corruption and retaliation were far more common than anyone wanted to acknowledge. 2 years after Derek Vance's arrest, Lena stood in Mitchell County Courthouse, the same building where she'd given the press conference that had started everything, for final ceremony marking completion of federally mandated reforms. The consent decree was being lifted, oversight transitioning from federal enforcement to civilian review board with actual authority, the institutional changes that had seemed impossible now embedded deeply enough to survive without external pressure. Sheriff Hardwick, who'd survived recall attempts and political challenges to see reforms through, stood beside her, his expression mixing exhaustion with cautious pride. We've implemented everything you demanded, he said quietly. Body cameras, civilian oversight, bias training, whistleblower protection, quarterly data publication. Some of it was painful, some of it was expensive, all of it was necessary. How many complaints this year compared to 2 years ago? Down 73%. And the complaints we do receive are being investigated thoroughly, resolved transparently, with officers held accountable when violations occur. He turned to face her directly. I know this doesn't undo what happened to you or the other victims, but it might prevent it from happening to the next person who gets pulled over on a dark highway. That's all anyone can ask. Not perfection, just commitment to doing better. Lena extended her hand, professional gesture that carried weight of reconciliation without forgiveness, acknowledgement without absolution. Thank you for staying and doing the hard work instead of taking the easy way out. The ceremony concluded with speeches from federal officials and county supervisors and victim advocates, all claiming credit for reforms that had been forced through resistance and reluctance and institutional inertia that preferred familiar dysfunction to uncomfortable change. Lena listened with detachment, born of understanding that politics required narrative simplification, that messy reality got packaged into sound bites about accountability and transparency and justice prevailing. But walking out of that courthouse into Nevada afternoon where heat shimmered off asphalt and mountains stood indifferent to human drama, Lena felt something approaching peace. Not closure. Trauma didn't close cleanly, justice didn't heal wounds it merely acknowledged. But recognition that she'd fought battles worth fighting, that resistance had mattered, that one phone call had cascaded into systemic change that would protect people she'd never meet from abuse she'd personally survived. Her phone buzzed with text from Jessica Moreno, now graduated from nursing school and starting her first shift at Silver Ridge Medical. First day complete. I saved a life today. Thank you for showing me this was possible. Lena typed response. You saved your own life by refusing to stay defeated. Everything else followed from that choice. She drove home through streets where afternoon transitioned into evening, the city's rhythm unchanged by federal investigations and criminal prosecutions and all the machinery of justice that had consumed 2 years of her life. People went to work, raised families, built futures in the comfortable assumption that authority existed to protect rather than exploit them. For most people, that assumption remained valid. For the people who discovered otherwise, the ones who got pulled over on dark highways by officers with agendas, who got arrested for crimes they didn't commit, who got told their truth didn't matter against official narratives, Lena's foundation existed as evidence that fighting back was possible, that systems could be challenged, that one person's refusal to accept injustice could trigger changes that protected thousands. That night, Lena stood at her apartment window, overlooking the city where she'd built civilian life after military service, where she'd been victimized and vindicated, where trauma had transformed into purpose through choice to help rather than hide. The scars remained, physical marks where handcuffs had abraded skin, psychological weight of violence she'd survived and inflicted, permanent hypervigilance that made her apartment feel like defensive position rather than home. But alongside the scars lived something stronger, certainty that she'd done everything right when circumstances had been completely wrong, that competence and courage had mattered more than authority or intimidation, that the training she'd carried from Afghanistan to trauma bays to that gas station had prepared her for battles she'd never anticipated but had won decisively. Her medal sat on the desk beside foundation files and hospital schedules, and all the mundane documentation of life lived in service to others. The recognition mattered less than the work it represented, but it existed as reminder that some institutions still valued the warriors who fought for principles beyond personal survival. Lena pulled out her laptop, reviewing 3 new applications for foundation support: a paramedic facing retaliation after reporting excessive force, a teacher threatened with termination for challenging administrator corruption, a veteran appealing VA benefits denial that smelled like institutional cover-up. Each case required investigation, resource evaluation, strategic planning about how to fight systems designed to defeat individual resistance. She accepted all 3 cases, began assigning lawyers and coordinating with advocacy partners, the work expanding because demand was infinite, and justice required constant vigilance against those who would exploit authority for personal gain. Her phone showed the time, 2:17 a.m., exactly the moment Derek Vance had snapped handcuffs on her wrists 2 years ago, the inflection point between one life and another, the second when civilian nurse had accessed warrior training and refused to be broken. Lena smiled at the symmetry, closed her laptop, and went to bed knowing that tomorrow would bring new battles, new victims needing support, new opportunities to prove that authority without accountability was just tyranny waiting to be challenged. She'd spend the rest of her life fighting those battles, building infrastructure that would outlast her involvement, training others to recognize and resist the patterns she'd survived. Because that was who she was beneath every other identity. Marine who'd sworn to protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Nurse who'd dedicated her life to saving others. Advocate who'd learned that sometimes justice required more than faith in systems that claimed to deliver it. And if anyone ever again made the mistake of thinking she was easy target, thinking her silence meant submission, thinking her exhaustion meant defeat, they'd discover what Derek Vance had learned too late. Some people don't break. They adapt, they fight back, and they transform trauma into purpose that changes everything. Lena Brooks was one of those people, and her story wasn't about being victimized by corrupt authority. It was about refusing to be defined by that victimization, about choosing to fight when surrender seemed easier, about one phone call that had proven systems could still work when pushed hard enough by someone who knew exactly which buttons to press. The gas station lights still flickered in her memory, but they no longer marked the place where she'd been arrested. They marked the place where she'd decided to resist, where training had met crisis, where one woman's refusal to accept injustice had triggered avalanche that buried corruption and built something better from the ruins. That story wasn't ending. It was just beginning to spread. Through foundation cases and training protocols, and victims who'd learned from her example that fighting back was possible, that justice could be claimed rather than just requested, that authority could be challenged by those brave enough to make the call. And somewhere in federal prison, Derek Vance had 18 years to contemplate the cost of underestimating the quiet nurse in blood-stained scrubs who'd looked at him with calm certainty and changed his entire world with 90 seconds of encrypted communication. Lena fell asleep thinking not of him, but of the lives still to be saved, the battles still to be fought, the endless work of ensuring that what had happened to her would happen to fewer people tomorrow than today. Because that was the real victory. Not personal vindication, but systemic change that protected the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. And she was just getting started.